Chapter 386. As soon as she met Immerse's eyes, she clenched the towel and looked into his eyes. Did you wake up just now? Or? I didn't wake up. What are you going to do to me after you brought me back? The man's eyes were deep and quiet. Or do you think you can solve any problem by bringing me back like this? Of course, Jin-won understood that nothing could be solved. It was as if time had passed and the circumstances had changed. When she faced him, she couldn't feel hot at all. Instead, she felt cold all over. Today's Immerse was not only the CEO who once terrified the business world, but also the global CEO of Shine Group who shocked and frightened the entire Western financial world. Everything about him was buried under a calm and indifferent shrewdness. Jin-won looked at his face. It was still so handsome, but it was also stained with the coldness and nobility of a superior. It was a face that she missed very much, but when she looked at it, she instinctively felt a chill in her heart. For this man, in addition to missing him, she felt more like a stranger. He was clearly drunk, but his eyes were cold and sharp, like a cold knife cutting her flesh. Jin-won thought for a while and then asked, "When did you wake up? Or were you not drunk at all?" The man sat on the sofa and didn't intend to get up, or maybe he was a little drunk and didn't intend to get up. He just looked at her and smiled, but his smile made her feel cold. He said slowly, "If I wasn't drunk, how could I allow you to sit in the driver's seat? It's very simple that I drove you back." Shenmue said his girlfriend had a stomachache, which can be serious or minor. He was in a hurry to go back, so he gave me the key. Jin-won said calmly, "I happened to be in that club and happened to not drink, so I drove you back." Immerse smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It seemed that he had seen through her purpose at a glance. His eyes were too cold and sharp. Jin-won seemed to have nowhere to hide in front of him. Even if what he did and refused to see her during this time aroused her resistance, she couldn't stand such treatment. If it were in the past, she would have jumped up and left. But Immerse had always been too good to her, and all his kindness made it impossible for her to be angry at him. Besides, she really missed him too much. But as soon as she met his eyes, Jin-won instinctively avoided his eyes and went into the kitchen. "The water is boiling. I'll make you some hangover medicine." As he spoke, he quickly walked into the kitchen, picked up a glass, and poured some water. Then, he placed the medicine into the glass and shook it gently as if he couldn't feel how hot the glass was. He walked out with the glass and placed it on the coffee table. The man sat there and looked at her fingers that had been scalded red. He looked at the skin on the back of her hand that was slightly redder than before. Although there were still some scars from Cambodia, they were indeed much lighter than a few months ago. He looked at her silently and didn't speak, nor did Jin-won. They were silent for a long time. Jin-won pointed to the glass on the table. "Drink some. Drink it while it's hot. The medicine will take effect faster. Shenmue said you drank a lot tonight, so you may have a stomachache or a headache. You'll feel better after drinking it." Immerse's face was expressionless as if he wasn't even interested in the glass of water she poured for him. Or perhaps, he was guarding against her. Against what? Was he afraid that she would drug him? Jin-won looked into his eyes. "Do you hate me so much now?" "Obviously." She paused and asked calmly, "When I was in the mall with Xia Tian, I saw you with Shuyen. Did you accompany her shopping? Or was there any other reason?" The man narrowed his eyes at her words. "What kind of answer do you want to hear?" Jin-won's lips moved. In the past, Immerse was the person who hated misunderstandings between them the most. Whenever there was the slightest misunderstanding, he would immediately give her a reasonable explanation to set her mind at ease and not let her imagination run wild. She wanted to ask where the Mo Jingshin who had always firmly pressed against her heart had gone. But when the words reached her mouth, she suddenly couldn't bring them out. Under the man's cold gaze, Jin-won stood behind the coffee table for a long time and said, "I can't understand whether your attitude toward me right now is disgust or wariness, or I don't know what else you mean, but from the beginning, I just wanted to live a good life. I didn't want to cling to anyone. You remember everything in the past, so you should know that my feelings for you and everything I've done are real. Just like how you used to treat me, it's all very pure." Before she finished speaking, she heard the man chuckle. It was the kind of cold, mocking chuckle that came from his chest. It was very light, but she heard it. The man stood up, walked around the coffee table and the cup of sobering tea on it, and walked up to her. The clear and clean smell of his body mixed with the smell of wine. Subconsciously, Jin-won felt all the pores on her body contract as he suddenly took the initiative to approach her. She raised her eyes to look at him. At the same time, the man leaned down to her, and his breath fell on the skin of her cheek. "Pure. Don't you feel embarrassed saying this word to me?" Jin-won raised her head to look at him and looked at him with a stubborn and serious expression that would not be overwhelmed by his aura. "Of course I don't feel embarrassed. I just learned a lesson and learned how to cherish, how to avoid all harm, and how to live a good life. I can bear the word pure. It's the same for you, Mo Jingshin. My feelings for you are pure enough. It's fine if you don't believe me, but you can't completely deny me like this." She stared at him steadily. "I can't easily give up on the man I once loved. A man who could even throw his life away for me. Right now, even if you directly stab a knife into my body, I won't say a single word. After all, the pain you've experienced is a million times worse than mine. Marriage is mine, the man is mine, and the family is what I have to protect. You don't have the right to make me give up." Mo Jingshin raised her chin, his voice soft and slow. "So stubborn. So affectionate." Jin-won saw the thick mockery in his eyes. His gaze was as dark and deep as ever, and his voice was as gentle and mild as ever. However, she raised her eyes to look at his cold expression. Aside from coldness, she could not capture any other emotions. Chapter 387. Although Jin-won wasn't seriously injured when she fell down the stairs in the Yew Garden yesterday, her forehead was a little red near her hairline. Other than a nude lipstick, she rarely used foundation, so the spot on her forehead was not covered. When she lowered her head and raised her head, the loose strands of hair fell back a little, revealing the red spot on her forehead. She held the glass in front of him and froze because of the man's gaze on her forehead. Neither of them spoke. The large space was so quiet that even the drop of a needle could be heard, but Jin-won's heartbeat was strangely particularly loud. The man looked at her and said in a low voice, "Jin-won, I never joke. Since you've mentioned divorce, you should break it off completely." He stood in front of her and didn't take the glass in her hand but just looked down at her indifferently. The light in the living room fell on the top of her head and seemed to cover her with a layer of light silver. He was cold and noble. Even though he reeked of alcohol, it didn't affect his handsomeness and charm at all. Mo Jingshin. He was Mo Jingshin. Jin-won kept reminding herself that no matter how cruel and heartless he was to her now, from the moment he rushed out in that black Bentley to protect her behind his back, she couldn't lose her temper at him. Maybe it was just a broken dream. Or maybe it was just a reality and she saw the real him. "Don't pester me anymore. I don't like pestering." He didn't raise his hand to take her glass from beginning to end. Seeing the man turn and leave without looking back, Jin-won felt as though her entire body was filled with a sense of helplessness. Her heart was filled with a sense of obstruction. The moment she heard the door open, the glass in Jin-won's hand fell to the ground. The man didn't look back but paused for a moment. Seeing him stand there without moving, and seeing him pause for a moment, Jean turned and walked over. She stood behind him and stared at his back for a long time before she slowly raised her hand and carefully hugged him from behind. In the past, when she wanted to hug him, she had never been so careful. She couldn't see the man's deep eyes. She could only feel the man's cruel and merciless hands trying to pull her hands away from him. Jean held him tightly. She didn't speak, nor did he. In silence, the two of them seemed to be fighting quietly. Her arms were entangled with his. But her strength was no match for his. He pulled her hand away and threw her back mercilessly. Jean took a few steps back and hit the wine cabinet by the wall. The few bottles of wine inside fell out and broke all over the floor. Red, white, and various colors of wine mixed together and flowed to her feet. Jean could not help but shiver as she felt the chill from beneath her feet. She looked at the ground and then up at the man in front of the door. His blood seemed to solidify in his body, slowly turning into ice at the same temperature as his blood. It was bone-chilling. Without a word, she suddenly bent down and stepped on the broken pieces on the floor to pick them up. Mo Jingshan turned his eyes to see Jean stepping on the broken pieces barefoot. He said coldly without raising his eyelids, "Jean, it's the stupidest thing to do to attract my attention by hurting yourself. The wounds on your feet won't move me. It will only make you unable to work for several days in a row. Not only will it delay your work, but it will also make me see your stupidity and boredom." Jean squatted on the ground as if she didn't hear his words. She avoided the broken pieces, but she was still scratched. She moved aside and picked up the broken pieces. After picking up some of them, she said calmly, "I didn't hurt myself." "Really?" He looked at the small but obvious bloodstains at her feet. "Take care of yourself." With that, he walked out of the door. Hearing the door open and close, Jean hands were still mechanically and numbly picking up the broken pieces. When she stepped on the broken pieces, she didn't seem to feel any pain. She got up to get a mop and a broom and swept the broken pieces. When she turned around, she found that there was a long trail of blood on the ground. She simply threw the things in her hands to the corner and sat on the ground that still had a lot of fragments. She sat by the side and watched as a few bottles of wine fell to the ground with only half of the upper part broken, while the lower part of the wine was still in the bottle. Jean picked up one of them. She didn't know what year it was, but she knew it couldn't be cheap since Mo Jingshan kept it at home. She avoided the broken bottle and raised her head to take a sip. It tasted strange and a little bitter. She picked up the other half of the bottle and poured it into her mouth in a way that avoided cutting her mouth. Tut, it was still bitter. She tasted several bottles in a row, but they were all bitter. She smacked her lips and licked the corner of her mouth, only to find that it was the bitter taste in her mouth. After wiping her mouth, she looked at the expensive wine on the ground and really couldn't bear to waste it. She didn't mind those spilled on the ground, but there was still some left at the bottom of the bottle. At least it was worth drinking. She took another sip. This time it was not so bitter, but it was a little astringent. She tasted another sip, and it tasted the same. The woman, who couldn't hold her liquor, sat on the ground with bare white and tender feet. She picked up one bottle after another and drank all the broken bottles. She narrowed her eyes, looked at the quiet closed door, couldn't see Mo Jingshan, and then looked back out of the window. Oh, so many stars. The black ghost sped on the road. Not long after Mo Jingshan left, he went to a nearby drugstore to buy medicine. When he got out of the car, he was about to hand the medicine to the security guard for Aolon International to send it up. However, the moment he got out of the car, he suddenly paused. He raised his eyes to see that on the balcony of the 18th floor, a woman in a skirt was sitting at the edge. Her two injured feet were swinging back and forth, and it seemed like a gust of wind could blow her down from the 18th floor. Mo Jingshan's expression darkened. He abruptly slammed the car door shut and picked up his phone to call Jinwan. The woman was still on the balcony, unmoving. He didn't know if the phone was placed inside or held in her hand. It rang for a long time before he finally picked it up. The moment the phone was picked up, Mo Jingshan's voice was cold. "Jinwan, what are you doing?" The woman's voice came through the phone in a daze. "Ah. Me? What am I doing?" "I'm looking at the stars." Mo Jingshan raised his eyes to look at the balcony of the 18th floor. The woman's legs were still swinging back and forth, and one hand was raised to her ear as she answered the phone. Dash. Chapter 388. It's been raining for days. Now the sky is dark and there's nothing. Why are you looking at the stars? Nothing. But I see a lot of stars. With that, the woman on the balcony began to swing her legs back and forth again. Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows. For a moment, he wondered if this woman had drunk all the wine in the bottles that had fallen on the ground. The door was suddenly opened, and the wind from the door to the open floor-to-ceiling windows fluttered the curtains, fluttering them in the air. The wind also ruffled the woman's skirt and hair on the balcony. Mo Jingshan glanced at the shallow bloodstains and the completely empty broken bottles on the ground, walked in, and saw where Jinwan was sitting on the balcony. "Jinwan, come down." Jinwan looked back at him and grinned at him with an intoxicated expression. "Why are you back? Didn't you leave?" Seeing her turn her head, Mo Jingshan frowned. "I asked you to come down, not to move." I'm fine here. It's safe." Jinwan lowered her head to look at where she was sitting and then muttered, "Your wine is really terrible. I didn't know that the wine in your cabinet was worse than the one before. But they must be very expensive, and I couldn't bear to spend them, so I drank all that I could. Hey, guess what? After drinking it, I actually saw stars." As she spoke, she lowered her head and then proudly crossed her legs on the balcony. Seeing that she actually had the courage to cross her legs, the coldness in Mo Jingshan's eyes rose. "Don't move." Jinwan looked at him in confusion. "What? Do you also want to see the stars?" With that, she suddenly moved her butt to the side. "Well, I'll make room for you. Come and see together." Mo Jingshan didn't say a word, abruptly dropped the medicine in his hand, strode over, and grabbed the arm of the woman who was swaying on the balcony. Jinwan was startled by his action and was about to withdraw her hand instinctively when she felt a weight on her shoulder and was carried down from the edge of the balcony by him. The moment her feet landed on the ground, she almost lost her balance and staggered in his arms. She instinctively grabbed his shirt and climbed up, then leaned into his arms, saying in confusion, "Mo Jingshan, why are you back?" "No. I should say, are you back?" The man did not speak but pulled her into the window from the balcony. He slammed the window shut and was about to push her away when the woman suddenly wrapped her arms around his neck. The smell of alcohol was thicker than his face. She whispered softly by his ear, "Are you back?" "Mo Jingshan, you've only just woken up, aren't you? You're back, aren't you?" Mo Jingshan pushed her to the sofa, and when she was about to get up and throw herself at him again, he said indifferently, "Sit down." Jinwan paused and sat down obediently on the sofa under his cold gaze. The man coldly glanced at her, picked up the broom she had thrown on the ground, swept up the broken pieces, and threw them away. Then he saw the shallow bloodstains on the ground, walked over, and saw that there were some fine glass shards on the soles of Jinwan's feet, and the dust and blood on the ground were stuck to her feet. Seeing the man come over, Jinwan didn't speak, but was suddenly picked up by the man like a chick and brought into the bathroom. "Mo Jingshan, what are you doing?" She looked at him in confusion. After entering the bathroom, Mo Jingshan was about to ask her to sit on the toilet lid so that he could help her wash her feet, but the woman was not obedient and moved her hands and feet. Seeing that she was completely drunk, the man suddenly turned on the shower head above, turned the water to the maximum, and poured it on her head and body. Jean Wan curled up on the toilet and shivered all over. Her whole body was washed by the cold water, and the shock and coldness made her mind clear for a moment. She raised her eyes, wiped the water off her face, and struggled to get up, but the man still pressed her firmly on the toilet and washed her from head to toe with cold water. "What are you doing?" Jean Wan couldn't speak. As soon as she spoke, water would come into her mouth. Afraid that she would choke, she could only try to turn her head away. Finally, the sound of water stopped. Then the man's voice, colder than the cold water just now, hit her, awake. Jean Wan sat stiffly on the toilet for a long time and did wake up. She turned to look at the man, whose black shirt and trousers were also splashed by the water, but he was clearly not as disheveled as she was. He looked at her coldly. "In order to make me stay, you really spared no effort." Jean Wan was stunned for a long time before she recalled the scene when she climbed onto the balcony to look at the stars. Just now, there really were no stars. She just drank the mixed wine, and then her eyes were full of stars. Her feet hurt a little, so she walked to the window and opened it. She wanted to see if Mo Jingshan had left, but she didn't know what she was thinking at that time. She actually climbed up and sat there to look at the sky. Her lips, which were pale from the cold water, moved. She raised her head to look at the man's indifferent eyes and said hoarsely, "Why did you come back? If you jump from the 18th floor, your blood will splatter on the spot, and the surrounding companies will be affected. Not only will you use your own life to affect the feng shui of High City, but it will also be bad luck for me to go from being divorced to being widowed." Jean Wan's rationality, which had been eroded by alcohol, was instantly pricked by his voice, and her nerves trembled. The man stared at her quietly with his deep, dark eyes. His tone was not heavy, and it was as though he was casually stating an unimportant matter. "It's even more stupid to fall to your death from the 18th floor because you're drunk. Don't do such things that will implicate others. Live well. Don't add to anyone's burden." Mo Jingshan threw the towel on her head and turned to walk out without any reluctance. Jean Wan tugged the towel off her head and looked at the man's cold and resolute back. "Mo Jingshan, am I a burden to you?" The man's long figure paused for a moment. He did not answer, and his back was cold as though he had really pulled out of her world and would never enter again. Jean Wan's eyelids drooped, and her eyes were half closed. Then, she slowly stood up with some difficulty. Her long hair wrapped around her shoulders like seaweed, and her white dress was translucent and stuck to her body because it was drenched. She looked like a seductive water demon. Chapter 389. Jean Wan put one hand against the door and raised the other to grab the man's sleeve. She turned her head and looked up at the man's indifferent eyes. "Say it, Mo Jingshan." The man's brows were full of indifference. He looked at her calmly and did not answer. "Say it." Jean Wan slowly steadied herself in front of the door and held the door tightly with both hands behind her. "Say something even more ruthless and cruel. Let me give up completely. Say it. What else can you do if you don't give up?" Looking at the redness brewing in her eyes, Mo Jingshan's eyes deepened inch by inch, and his lips curved in a cold and heartless smile. "What kind of night do you want to make with the little bit of alcohol in your body and the little bit of alcohol in mine? Or do you think you are charming enough to make me repeat the same mistake with you?" As the man spoke, he skillfully pinched her chin with his slender and well-defined fingers, not forcing her to open the door. At the moment when Jean Wan was startled, he leaned over without warning, pressed her against the door, bent his head dangerously and ambiguously to her lips, and chuckled hoarsely and indifferently. "Why don't you say it directly? What do you want?" Jean Wan instinctively raised her hand to push him away, but as soon as she raised it, he abruptly held her wrist. His cool, unpleasant masculine scent enveloped her, and his breath brushed against her lips. "If you want it, just say it. It's just a matter between a man and a woman. Just say it. After all, we've slept together so many times. I'm not so heartless that I won't reject you even if you send yourself to my door. If you say you're lonely, I can understand you." The man's voice was low and indifferent. To be precise, he completely trampled on her self-esteem. Jean Wan was so angry that her tears almost fell. Did he deliberately want to shatter his image and all the good things he had in her heart? Feeling the man's head approaching, Jean Wan subconsciously turned her head away, but he held her chin and turned her face back. When she was about to say that she didn't mean that, the man had firmly imprisoned her, bent down, and accurately landed on her lips. Her lips were covered with the familiar softness. When Jean Wan reacted, the man had pried open her lips and tongue and plunged deep into her mouth. "No." Jean Wan struggled hard, but he firmly pressed her arms against the door and she could not move at all. She instinctively raised her legs, but at the same time, the man held her down and she could not move at all. "Mo Jingshan, you, og." Jean Wan desperately turned her head away, but the man seemed to be deliberately kissing her fiercely. Again and again, he entangled himself in her mouth in a way that made her feel extremely uncomfortable and almost unable to breathe. Jean Wan didn't know how long it had been since he last touched or kissed her. She only felt that under the entanglement of such a deep and heavy kiss, all her senses and nerves were trembling violently. Even her heart was beating violently. When the tip of her tongue was lifted, the man's merciless kiss slightly slowed down because of her uncontrollable tears falling into their mouths. For a moment, it seemed that the familiar Mo Jingshan was kissing her, kissing away the salty taste in her mouth, kissing away the wetness in the corner of her mouth, and was about to kiss away the tears on her face, when he paused for a moment. He held the back of her head and looked at her quietly with his deep, bottomless, black eyes. He watched the woman lean against the door like a dying fish and breathe heavily because of the kiss a moment ago. Her eyes were red and full of tears. He was silent for a moment, and his eyes were so deep that she could not see through them. He slowly curved his lips. "Is this what you want?" Jean Wan's brain trembled. The familiar gentleness at that moment almost confused her, but when the man spoke again, she instinctively tried to push him away. However, the man quickly took her into his arms, pressed her against the door, and held her firmly in his arms. The kiss that fell on her again was even more fierce and deep than before. Jean Wan pushed him away in vain, but it had no effect except to make the man hold her more tightly. Her breath seemed to be cruelly robbed, and she fell limp in his arms because it was difficult to breathe. Mo Jingshan finally let go of her and withdrew from her lips. Jean Wan's pale face had turned red, and her mouth was full of the man's refreshing taste. She leaned against the door softly and almost slipped down. Her hand weakly held on to the door handle to steady herself. She didn't even have the strength to raise her head to see the expression on his face. She could only hear his cold words falling on her head. "Do you want more? I don't mind fulfilling your wish here tonight." Mo Jingshan's voice was full of condescending mockery. "Since you still refuse to divorce, from a legal point of view, it seems that I can indeed perform this kind of husband and wife duty a few more times before the divorce. I think you must miss it very much." Jean Wan couldn't care about anything else. She leaned against the door, lowered her head, and panted. Her fingers clenched the door handle, motionless. The moment she heard the man's cold smile and asked, do you want to continue? She suddenly let go of the door handle, raised her hand, and was about to slap him in the face. He didn't intend to stop her. He just stood motionless in front of her and looked at her. However, her hand still didn't fall but froze in the air. Looking at the man's cold expression, the image of the black Bentley that was smashed in front of her on the Los Angeles freeway that day flashed in front of her. Jean Wan's hand froze in the air. Then she slowly put down her hand, clenched her fists, and her nails dug deep into her palms. Mo Jingshan, even if I left a bad impression on you, you can't forget all the feelings we have had for each other for so long. Do you really feel good about being so cruel and heartless to me? His lips curled into a cold and piercing smile. He looked at her with a deep and shallow gaze. She couldn't tell which of his words were true and which were false. His voice was indifferent. To be honest, even if you really jump off the balcony from where you are standing right now, I won't feel anything. Why would I feel good or bad? Jean Wan's hand loosened and tightened and loosened again, and finally leaned against the door. She lowered her eyes to look at her bare feet, closed her eyes, and then forced a smile. No one knew who she was smiling at. She struggled to twist the door handle behind her, and when the door was opened, she picked up the bag on the shoe cabinet by the door, turned around, and walked out, despite the fact that her body and head were still wet. Chapter 390. Jean Wan completely ignored the man's voice behind her and didn't answer. She walked straight out, went to the elevator, pressed the down button, and stood there silently waiting for the elevator. Mo Jingshan came out and put a bath towel on her deadpan. You're all wet. Go in and take a bath. Don't wander around. Jean Wan waved the bath towel off her back and said indifferently, No, this is your place. I shouldn't have come. The man looked at her as if her heart had been hollowed out and didn't speak for a while. At the moment the elevator door opened, Jean Wan walked straight in. She had forgotten where she had taken off her shoes when she hurriedly helped him into the house. Anyway, it made no difference whether she wore shoes or not. She walked in barefoot, no longer looking at the man's face, and after counting to 1, the elevator door slowly closed in front of her. Suddenly, the elevator door opened again, and the man stood outside with a cold face, his hand on the button outside the door. When the door was about to close again, he walked in. Jean Wan stood against the wall of the elevator and looked at him expressionlessly. What are you doing? How can you walk like this? Go back with me. The man's face was still cold, but his hand had come over to grab her arm and take her out of the elevator. Jean Wan didn't have the strength to break free, and her lips still felt numb. When he reopened the door and brought her back inside, she looked at the familiar space in front of her and said calmly and soberly, After all, this is your place. As long as I am here, you will definitely leave. I can't always occupy your place. I am a woman who is no longer important to you. When it's time to be self-conscious, I have to be self-conscious and return this place to you. The man ignored her words, put the bath towel on her again, and said coldly with a hint of sternness in his voice. Go take a bath. I'll go back to the Yew Garden to take a bath. Don't make me say it again. Jean Wan stood still, but her heart was cold all over. Or do you want me to take a bath for you? Hearing this, she paused. Her hand clutched her bag, and after a long time, she turned around and walked out, not wanting to say another word. However, before she stepped out of the door, her arm was abruptly pulled back. Before she could steady herself, Mo Jingshan dragged her into the bathroom. When Jean Wan was about to push him away, he raised his hand and grasped her wrist, making it impossible for her to escape. He said dangerously and threateningly, I'll give you one last chance. Wash yourself, or I'll tear your clothes off right now. Mo Jingshan. Her voice was sullen and hoarse. The man was indifferent. His hands were already about to tear her clothes. No. Jean-Wan hurriedly raised her hand to press against her clothes, using her bent elbow to push him away. Are you going to wash or not? This seemed to be his last warning. Jean-Wan was indeed very cold. She had caught a cold these days, and she had even taken a cold shower earlier. She was cold from the inside out. Her teeth were chattering. She didn't know if it was because of the cold or because she was afraid. Only now did she realize that there would actually be a day when she would be afraid of Mo Jingshan. Earlier, when he kissed her, he did not hold back. If he really took off her clothes like this, or if something really happened here tonight, she suspected that she might lose half her life. When he was gentle to her, his strength was enough to make her unable to get out of bed. If he were to touch her under such circumstances, who knew what would happen to her? I'll wash myself. She held on to her clothes. He stepped back, walked around the water stains on the floor, and walked out of the bathroom again. He only threw down a cold sentence, 15 minutes. If you don't come out, I'll come in. Jean-Wan looked at his back and then at the bathtub by the side. He forced her to come back to take a hot shower, but only gave her 15 minutes to take a shower. She turned to close the bathroom door and then took off her wet and sticky clothes. She only had 15 minutes to take a shower, and there was no time to soak in the bathtub. She picked up the shower head that Mo Jingshan had thrown aside, turned on the hot water, and washed herself well. She washed herself from head to toe. She didn't know how long it had been. It should be almost 15 minutes. She turned off the water, put on the bathtub, and went out. After all, she had lived in Aolon International before, so there were many of her clothes in the bedroom closet. She was about to enter the bedroom to change when she suddenly heard Mo Jingshan throw 2 boxes of medicine on the coffee table. Take the antipyretics before going to bed. Even if the injury on your foot is not serious, apply some medicine. Don't get yourself covered in scars. Jean-Wan turned to see the medicine he had placed on the coffee table. She had only caught a cold, and her fever was not serious. Earlier, did he feel an unusual heat on her body? He was very familiar with her body and could even detect the slightest abnormality. But right now, she was completely unfamiliar with him, even a stranger. She did not speak and went into the bedroom to change. When she came out, Mo Jingshan had already disappeared. Jean-Wan thought that he had found his conscience for a moment, or had recovered his usual patience and gentleness, telling her to take a shower, eat, and take the medicine. But it turned out that he was no longer accompanying her but leaving. In such a large apartment, every room was particularly empty and quiet. She walked to the sofa and sat down. She picked up the medicine box and opened it. She dug out a pill of antipyretics and put it in her mouth. She turned to see the medicine on the sofa. It did not look like the medicine in the medicine box but seemed to be newly bought. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Earlier, did Mo Jingshan go out to buy medicine for her because her foot was scratched by the shrapnel? She narrowed her eyes. This man who clearly seemed to want to push her away but still seemed to want to control her, what exactly did he mean? Jean-Wan placed the medicine down and calculated that Mo Jingshan had only gone down for a few minutes. It would take at least 2 minutes for the elevator to go down from the 18th floor. She hesitated, stood up, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She opened the windows and stepped onto the balcony again, looking down. The black ghost was parked there. The car lights were already on, indicating that the man had gotten into the car but did not drive away. Jean-Wan stared at the car below. She stood on the balcony and watched for more than 10 minutes, but the car really did not leave. Was he afraid that she would climb onto the balcony again to court death? If she really climbed onto the balcony, the most dangerous position, would he come up again? Jean Wan's hand gently stroked the edge of the balcony railing. She laughed at her own shameful and ridiculous thoughts. Chapter 391. Jean Wan left the balcony, closed the window, and returned to the sofa. She picked up the medicine to apply to the wound under her foot while looking at her cell phone. After applying the medicine, she picked up her cell phone and sent a text message to Mo Jingshan. "I'm sleeping. Good night." After sending the message, after a while, when the medicine under her foot was dry, she got up and went to the balcony again. When she looked down, the car had already left. Jean Wan raised her eyes to look at the heavy traffic on the long street in the distance. He cared about her life and death, but he refused to have feelings for her. Interesting. Really interesting. Since you want me to live well so much. Then Mo Jingshan, from today on, I will live a nourishing and exciting life, so exciting that you can't even avoid it. You can see my shadow everywhere. High City in summer was hot enough. Mo and Wan's studio was about to move to a new location. The office building had been built, and some of the internal offices needed to be cleaned up. It would probably be completed in more than a week. Jean Wan, wearing a loose white printed t-shirt and casual shorts, was busy in the office with the tools for painting the wall in her hand. Xia Tian had just returned from buying a dozen popsicles and saw that the others who had come in to clean up the office had gone to bed, but Jean Wan was still working hard. You really don't think of yourself as a boss. So many of your employees have sat down to rest. Why are you still painting there alone? Didn't the renovation workers say that these places will be blocked by glass? It's useless to paint them white. Anyway, they can't see them. Xia Tian went over and took out a popsicle from the bag and handed it to her. It's so hot. The building hasn't been connected to electricity, and the air conditioner isn't working. I'm sweating all over. Come and cool down. Jean Wan painted the last part of the office white, put down the tools in her hand, raised her hand to wipe the sweat on her face, and a piece of white paste on her hand rubbed against her cheek. There was not only white on her face, but also on her nose, chin, and neck. Xia Tian held back her laughter and handed her the popsicle. Eat it first. Remember to wash your face later. Jean Wan looked at her in confusion, tore open the bag of popsicles and said, "Why are you laughing? Have you never seen such a beautiful boss? I've never seen a boss who looks like he's possessed by a fierce bull. What's wrong with you this week? Some time ago, you were dispirited and listless, but recently, you're full of motivation. You even work so hard. I don't think you need to work out recently. You just need to accompany the group of workers in this building to decorate and paint the walls." Jean Wan took the wet towel from Xiao Ba and wiped her hands. Then she took a bite of the popsicle and turned to look at the wall in the office. I don't plan to put glass there anymore. I plan to put something else. It's more comfortable to paint it in the same color. Xia Tian raised her eyebrows and glanced at the white patches on her face. When I went out just now, I met Vince in a nearby cafe. He is the one who has been sending you flowers. He knows that you are here and said that he will treat us to iced coffee in a while. He specially invited you. Will you go with him? Jean Wan was expressionless. Didn't I tell you to tell him not to send me flowers in the future? You know what I mean. Why did you still agree to his invitation? Xia Tian spread out her hands. Boss Missouri has been hard to find recently. I have to find a second love for you. As the best bestie in the world, don't you understand my good intentions? Jean Wan rolled her eyes. I think you're tired of my peaceful life and want to stir up some trouble for me. I'm not interested in that, Mr. Vince. If he wants to cooperate with me on a new project, I can meet him. But don't talk about anything else. Do you have to be so principled? You have principles, but that doesn't mean your husband has them. This morning, I saw a business magazine taking a photo of Mo Jingshan at an exhibition. Several of High City's socialites also attended the exhibition. As Xia Tian spoke, she looked at Jin Wan seriously. Those socialites are still eyeing him covetously. They won't miss a single exhibition. They all stand behind him and ask to take a photo with him. And look at you. Every day, you dress up like a decorator. Even I feel embarrassed to say that you're Mrs. Mo. Jin Wan nibbled the popsicle seriously and said carelessly, I also received the invitation to the exhibition, but I didn't attend it. So what if you were photographed standing with them? Did you see them kissing or hugging? When did you become so open-minded? Xia Tian looked at her incredulously and raised her hand to touch her head. A while ago, I thought you would collapse at any time like Lin Daiyu, but it seems that you don't look like that recently. Jin Wan slapped her hand away, raised her hand to touch her head, and casually explained, I just feel that some things are not what they seem on the surface. Life has to go on. I can't keep living in depression and making my life a mess. Xia Tian sneered. That's so profound. I don't understand. Big sister, can you explain it a little more simply? Jin Wan bit the popsicle and said vaguely, I can only say that I'm more persevering in fighting. Xia Tian chuckled and wanted to touch her head again to see if she really had a fever. However, after eating the popsicle, Jin Wan picked up the tools, turned back to the office, climbed up the high stool nimbly, and continued to paint the wall. Xiao Ba leaned over to Xia Tian and whispered, Sister Xia, who provoked boss? Xia Tian shook her head. I don't know. I think maybe he was really provoked. With that, Xia Tian was about to step forward to help Jin Wan when she saw a business magazine on the high stool Jin Wan was stepping on. The cover of the magazine was the one in which Mo Jingshan and those love-struck ladies were photographed in the same frame, but this magazine was being stepped on by Jin Wan as a footrest. Xia Tian, Jin Wan was busy in the new office building for 2 days. Xia Tian persuaded her to go back, but she ignored her. Her cell phone was left here without charging and was turned off for 2 days. When she left the building and was about to go back to the studio, she charged her cell phone in the car and turned it on. As she expected, she saw a large number of messages and missed calls pouring in. If her partners couldn't reach her, they would naturally call other people in the studio. Most of the missed calls were from the Mo family. They were from the Mo family. Then there were calls from the Yu Garden and Auntie Chin. Chapter 392. My great aunt, there's finally news of you. As soon as she received Jin Wan's call, Auntie Chin hurriedly sighed and said, Grandfather Mo called you all day yesterday, but he couldn't find you. Last night, he came to the Yu Garden, only to find that you and Mr. Mo were not there. We didn't dare to say much and just said that you and Mr. Mo were very busy recently, but Grandfather Mo must have found something wrong between you and Mr. Mo, so he left angrily. Today, he went back to the Mo family, but he asked me to contact you and tell you to go back to him immediately. When Jin Wan saw so many calls earlier, she guessed that it must be related to Elder Mo. Hearing this, she felt even more guilty. After returning from America, she and Mo Jingshan had not returned to the Mo family. My studio is going to move, so I've been busy here and didn't have time to care about home. Mr. Mo hasn't returned to the Yu Garden recently. I didn't dare to tell Elder Mo about this, but it's not good to keep it a secret. Madam, you should go back to the Mo family. Elder Mo didn't find you, and he didn't even get through to Mr. Mo's phone. Elder Mo is really angry. Jin Wan immediately looked at the time. I'll take some time to go to the Mo family in the afternoon. Did grandfather say anything before he left? He didn't say anything. He only asked you to return to the Mo family. All right, I understand. For so long, Grandfather Mo had doted on her the most and spoiled her the most. After returning to China, she hadn't visited the Mo family. It wasn't that she didn't miss Grandfather Mo, but that Mo Jingshan hadn't returned, and she couldn't go back to the Mo family by herself. In the past, they were always together, and now they were alone. It would definitely arouse suspicion. After all, the Mo family didn't only have Grandfather Mo, there were also his relatives who often visited the Mo family. In order not to make Elder Mo angry for too long, Jean Wan returned to the studio to tidy up, changed her clothes, and drove to the Mo family. It took her an hour to go from Jean Lin building to the Mo family's old mansion. When she arrived, Jean Wan called Auntie Chin to reassure her. After getting out of the car, Jean Wan found that Grandfather Mo had been waiting for her in the front yard. Jean Wan put on a big smile and walked in with the boxes of tonics she had specially bought on the way. Elder Mo saw that she was alone and immediately walked out. He looked her up and down several times before glancing behind her. His face was filled with dissatisfaction and unhappiness as he asked in a heavy voice, "Why didn't Jingshan come back with you?" Mo Group is about to merge with Shine. He has a lot of things to do and can't leave. I just finished my work and saw so many calls on my phone, so I hurried back to see you. As Jean Wan spoke, she stepped forward and held on to Elder Mo's arm with a smile. "Grandfather, people of our age are all busy. You have to understand. When you were young, you must have worked harder than us. If we don't work hard when we're young, how can we live out our remaining years as leisurely as you?" Elder Mo harumphed. "Don't talk to me like you're stirring honey. Last night, when I went to the Mo family, you and Jingshan weren't there. I asked Xiao Qin, and she only said that you've been busy recently. Fine, you can be busy, but you've been so busy that you haven't even come back to see this old man for several months. I'm just getting old and have one foot in the coffin, but it's not like I'm lying in it entirely. Did you have to forget this old man so early? You're destined to live for more than 100 years. Although you're angry, don't randomly curse yourself. Auntie Chen is right. We're just too busy." Jean Wan's face was full of smiles. Elder Mo snorted and stopped talking nonsense with her. After dragging Jean Wan into the front hall, the servant came in with tea, and Elder Mo still sat down without a smile. Jean Wan handed the tonic in her hand to the servant, looked around, and found that Uncle O, the butler she often saw before, was not here. She asked curiously, "Where is Uncle O? Why don't I see him? He fell and hurt his leg." "He won't come back until 2 months later," Elder Mo said grumpily. Elder Mo grumpily said, "Now that he's injured, there's no one at home to play chess with me. You and Jingshan went out for so long, and now that you're finally back, you didn't even mention to visit me at the Mo home." Seeing Elder Mo grumbling like an old child who didn't get candy, Jean Wan held back her laughter, squatted by his leg, and eagerly massaged his leg, saying, "It's all our fault. In the future, even if Jingshan is too busy to come back, I'll definitely come back to accompany you." "Humph," Elder Mo harumphed again and turned his head away. This time, the old man had an unhappy expression on his face. Jean Wan continued to massage his leg. "All right, Grandpa, don't be angry. I know I'm wrong. I'll think of you every day." After being coaxed by her for a long time, Elder Mo relaxed and looked down at Jean Wan, whose eyes were curved with a smile. "Is there any problem between you and Jingshan?" Jean Wan forced a smile. "What problem can we have?" Elder Mo looked at her steadily, reached out to press Jean Wan's hand that had been hammering his leg, and patted the back of her hand with his wrinkled hand. "Child, if you've been wronged, you must tell me." "I know. I'll tell you if there's anything. Don't worry. We're fine." Did you spend the New Year's Eve with Xiao Zhe when you were in Los Angeles a few months ago? Yes, yes. You've met Jingshan's mother. I've met her. She's a very good person and treats me very well. Grandpa, you really don't have to worry about us. No matter where you are, we're fine. As long as you're healthy, it's fine. As Jean Wan spoke, she removed her hand and raised her head to look at him. Grandpa, you've heard of the saying, having an elder at home is like having a treasure. You're our treasure. No one dares to forget you. Elder Mo watched as Jean Wan raised her head to look at him like an adorable little deer. He smiled and reached out to pat her head. As expected, my granddaughter-in-law is the most considerate. It's said that girls are like little cotton padded jackets. If you and Jingshan can quickly give me a granddaughter, I'll probably be happy to live for another 20 to 30 years. Then you can accompany us for another few decades. With an old treasure like you at home, others can only be envious. Elder Mo's mood was greatly improved by her words. He picked up the tea and took a sip. He had Jean Wan stop squatting and quickly sit down. Chapter 393. Grandfather Mo snorted. During the new year, these people did come, but I drove them away. Why did you drive them away? It'll be more lively with these people at home. Nonsense. They're all glib-tongued and don't speak a word of truth. When they see me, they fight with each other openly and covertly. I'm not their grandfather or father. I'm just Mo. If they want a piece of my pie, they have to ask me if I agree. They come here all day to flatter me. They might as well deal with their own family affairs. They have no ability at all. They've learned to cling to the Mo family's thigh since they were young. I'm too lazy to entertain them anymore. With that, Grandfather Mo suddenly remembered something. By the way, during the new year, there's one more thing. I have an old friend in South Africa whose family runs a jewelry business. Not long ago, they discovered the world's largest and most complete 10-carat blue diamond. At that time, you and Jingshan were in Los Angeles. Because Jingshan had talked to South Africa before, I knew he wanted to give you a unique gift, so I left the blue diamond for Jingshan. It's in your room. Wait a minute. I'll bring it out for you. Jean Wan paused and hurriedly got up to follow him. Grandfather Mo had gone out of the front hall and excitedly asked the servants to help him upstairs to fetch it. Not long after, Grandfather Mo came back with a velvet box and handed it to Jean Wan. Come on, open it. Jean Wan still looked at Grandfather Mo in surprise and then at the envious servants around her. After thinking for a while, she opened the box. The blue diamond in the box was very big. It shone brightly under the light of the front hall and was incredibly beautiful. And it was really a very complete round blue diamond. It was not deliberately designed to be a water drop, a heart, or any other popular shape. It was a complete round, but it was the most valuable and complete diamond shape among the blue diamonds. Jean Wan didn't know much about jewelry, but she knew that blue diamonds were very rare and more expensive than any diamond in the world, not to mention such a pure and complete round blue diamond. Such a diamond was worth at least hundreds of millions. Grandpa, this is too expensive. Jean Wan was about to quickly put the box back on the table when the old man glared at her. He glared at her until she withdrew her hand. It doesn't matter if it's expensive or not. It's not like the Mo family can't afford it. Besides, I didn't reserve this blue diamond. Jingshan had long noticed that you rarely wore rings after you got married. Those big and small wedding rings were too restrictive. Perhaps you wouldn't like them. He had intended to give this blue diamond to you a long time ago, but he had been waiting for the rarest and most complete one. Now that he had finally found one, how could he not give it to you? A few months ago, you weren't in Haiching. When they delivered the blue diamond, I accepted it on your behalf. You can take it as a gift from the Mo family. It's a token of my sincerity, and it's also a token of Jingshan's sincerity. My best granddaughter-in-law deserves the best diamond. Hearing that it was something Mo Jingshan had ordered a long time ago, Jin Wan's hand paused. It's fine if you don't like the wedding ring, but this blue diamond was personally ordered by Jingshan. You can't possibly refuse it. The old man smiled as he spoke. This is a blue diamond that hasn't been processed. If you think it's too big and can't find an occasion to wear it, you can just put it away. Isn't it said that women need more jewelry to have a sense of security? You silly girl, you don't even want the jewels and diamonds I gave you. Grandpa, the Mo family is my safest haven. Why would I need these worldly possessions to find a sense of security? But this is really too expensive. Jin Wan opened the box and glanced at it. Such a big one. The price of it is probably enough to open several companies in Haiching. Elder Mo smiled until his eyes narrowed. You're quite knowledgeable. Anyway, the Mo family doesn't lack money. Since I'm giving it to you, I'm giving it to you. If you really don't want it, go talk to Jingshan and see if he can help you turn this diamond into a few companies for you to play with. Jin Wan heard the teasing in his words and immediately became embarrassed. Grandpa, I'm very serious about my studio. No matter if it's the studio or the company, I can't just play around. I know. It's just that you, this child, could have stayed at home and lived a comfortable life as a rich wife, but you insisted on opening a studio and even took on so many contracts. How good do you think it is in the business world? Aren't you the one who has to suffer? At first, I thought you were just playing around. Later, I found that you were indeed too serious. But why do you have to work so hard? Jin Wan smiled and did not explain further. It was already very late when she left the Mo family. Jin Wan drove past the Mo Corporation and stopped for a while in the square opposite. She raised her eyes to look at the floor-to-ceiling windows on the top floor of the Mo Corporation. From here, she could accurately find the location of Mo Jingshan's CEO office. She could also see the lights in his office. Looking in the direction of the light, she reached out to pick up the velvet box on the passenger seat, opened it, and saw the round blue diamond that still shone brightly in the dark car. Such a perfect circle seemed to be a route that could never be taken wrong. After all, it was a circle. No matter which angle it went, which side it went, it would eventually return to the starting point and would never deviate from the original route. Such a perfect shape, in her hand, was repeatedly rubbed by her fingers. After lingering outside the Mo Corporation for a long time, Jin Wan finally got out of the car. It was already late. Most of the staff in the Mo Corporation building had gotten off work, and some were working overtime. There were several offices on each floor with lights on. Jin Wan went to the top floor. Shenmue guessed that at this time, he had also gotten off work. The office on the top floor was very quiet, and there were few people in the secretary's office and assistant's office. Only a man in his 30s with glasses came out of the water closet. When he saw Jin Wan, he froze for a moment and then asked Jin Wan respectfully and politely, "Are you Mrs. Mo?" Jin Wan gave him a strange look. "Do you know me?" "Hello, I'm the secretary manager of CEO Mo. My surname is Ko." The man said to her with a smile, "When I was hired as the secretary, Special Assistant Shin showed me your photo. He said that if you came to the company, there was no need to make an appointment or inform us. You could come in directly." Chapter 394. Secretary Cook pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose very seriously. It's not easy to be a secretary in these multinational companies. The workload is so heavy, and there are more and more male secretaries. Besides, there are both men and women in the secretarial office. The more detailed work is done by the female secretaries, and the more complicated work, such as CEO Mo's frequent business trips, is handled by a male secretary like me. The division of labor is very clear. Jean-Wan smiled because of his words. In fact, she was not surprised by the male secretary. Of course, she knew that there were many male secretaries now, and this position could be held by both men and women. Sometimes, men could do more things than women, and of course, the workload was also greater. She was surprised that the position of secretary-manager had been vacant for so long, but in the end, he chose a male secretary. She used to be jealous, wondering if he would have another beautiful female secretary by his side, but in the end, it was actually, Mrs. Mo, are you here to see CEO Mo? He is in the office. You can go directly to him, Secretary Kut said as he poured water in the water room. I'm not in a hurry. What are you doing? CEO Mo discussed several projects with Shine in the United States last night. After all, there is a time difference between China and the United States. He was busy all night and didn't rest during the day. Now he has to continue a conference with the United States. I'm afraid he can't stand it, so I want to make a cup of coffee for him. Secretary Ko looked around as he spoke. But I don't seem to find any good coffee. Jean-Wan looked at the cup in his hand and said with a faint smile, don't you know that CEO Mo seldom drinks coffee? I don't think so. President Mo has been drinking coffee a lot recently. He doesn't sleep much at night. When he's busy, he relies on coffee to pass his days. Sometimes I'm afraid that his body can't take it. But President Mo does drink a lot of coffee recently. I guess the bag of coffee that Special Assistant Shin bought has been emptied. Now the coffee in the hot water room is left here by other secretaries, not President Mo's. I don't know if he can get used to it. The smile in Jean-Wan's eyes faded. You often drink coffee recently? Secretary Ko nodded and finally found the bag of imported coffee. He picked it up and looked inside. It's empty. With that, he handed the bag to Jean-Wan. This bag is enough for 2 months. CEO Mo drank it up in less than a month. Jean-Wan glanced at the bag and did not speak for a moment. Then she took the bag and said, if there's nothing else, you can go home. I'll take care of the coffee. Secretary Kun knew that she was Mrs. Mo, so she didn't ask much. In that case, I'll have to trouble you, Mrs. Mo. I'll go back to the office to work for a while. CEO Mo's workload has been very heavy recently. If possible, please persuade him not to work day and night without caring about his health. No matter how young and healthy he is, he can't work like this. Got it. After Secretary Ko left, Jean-Wan stood in front of the water closet for a while, threw away the coffee bag in her hand, and turned to enter the elevator. She went to a porridge shop downstairs to buy a bowl of red date glutinous rice porridge and took it upstairs. When she reached the top floor, she saw that Secretary Ko was still there, so she handed the porridge to him. Take this to CEO Mo. Secretary Ko immediately smelled the porridge and looked at Jean-Wan with bright eyes. The red dates and glutinous rice are good for the stomach, but Mrs. Mo, aren't you going in? Didn't you come to see CEO Mo? I won't go in and disturb him. You don't have to say that I bought this porridge. Jean-Wan said and smiled at him again, her attitude calm and unperturbed. Although Secretary Ko was dutiful, he didn't know as much as Shinmu about the relationship between Jean-Wan and Mo Jingshin. Hearing Jean-Wan's words, he nodded and turned to walk to the CEO's office. 5 minutes later, Secretary Ko came out and took out the bowl of porridge in his hand. Jean-Wan was about to leave, but she still hesitated in the corridor for a long time. When she looked back, she saw Secretary Ko coming out. "Mrs. Mo, why don't you take it in?" Secretary Ko was a tall man. He held the bowl in one hand and pushed up the glasses on the bridge of his nose with the other. He said in frustration, "I asked CEO Mo to eat some porridge before he started working, but he didn't even pay attention to me. He even asked me to take out the porridge and pour it out." Jean Wan narrowed her eyes. "Did you tell him that I bought this porridge? How did you know?" Secretary Cook coughed and looked embarrassed. Jean Wan resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "Why did you tell him?" "I was afraid that CEO Mo wouldn't drink it. I thought that since you bought it, he would know your good intentions and drink some, but who knew that he would ask me to take it out and throw it away," Secretary Cook said with a round expression. Seeing Jean Wan didn't speak, Secretary Cook pushed the porridge in front of her again. "Why don't you go in and have a try?" Why should she try? If she went in, the porridge would not be as simple as being thrown away. Secretary Cook didn't notice Jean Wan's expression. He stuffed the porridge into her hand and pointed to the secretary's office. "I was sorting out the contract just now, and there are still some parts that haven't been sorted out. I'll leave the porridge to you, Mrs. Mo. I'll go back first." With that, Secretary Ko slipped back to the secretary's office. Jean Wan stood outside the door of the CEO's office, looking at the bowl of porridge in her hand that could be thrown away at any time, and fell into a dilemma of hesitation. If she didn't take it in, the bowl of porridge would be cold. After hesitating for a moment, Jean Wan raised her hand and knocked on the door, but there was no response. She pushed the door open and walked in. As soon as she entered, she shivered. Although it was -30 degrees outside at night, the air conditioner in this office was too cold. Glancing at the 18 degrees displayed on the air conditioner, Jean Wan glanced at the man behind the desk, and then turned around to look for the remote control of the air conditioner. The air conditioner in his office wasn't the integrated kind, but a separate one. After finding the remote control, she raised the number of the air conditioner, turned her eyes, and stared fixedly at the man who was staring at her without a word because she came in. The temperature in the office gradually rose, and it was neither too hot nor too cold. Jean Wan was still dressed in the white t-shirt and jeans she had been wearing for the past few days. Her hair was tied loosely behind her head, and she wore no makeup. Her brows were as calm as ever, her eyes dark and bright, and her skin fair. She never liked to put on makeup, and her facial features were beautiful. At this moment, she was no longer as tentative and careful as before. There was no smile on her face. Holding the porridge bowl in both hands, she walked over and put the bowl on his desk. Chapter 395. Mo Jingshan glanced at her expressionlessly. Obviously, he had no intention of eating it. Jean Wan stood in this familiar office. The man in front of her was no longer as gentle as he used to be. He exuded obvious alienation and indifference. Jean Wan could see his dissatisfaction from his eyes, so she smiled knowingly. "Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to pester you. CEO Mo, you can think of it as the person in charge of my small studio. After you invested 200 million yuan in our studio, I came here to curry favor with you. Just think about it from another perspective." With that, she suddenly turned and walked to his break room. "Eat your food. I'll go to your break room and take away all the clothes you bought for me in the wardrobe." Then, she walked straight in without looking back. She acted as if she were just passing by his office. The break room was still the same. It was silent. She turned on the light, and the cold-toned, completely masculine break room was in front of her. Jean Wan went straight to the wardrobe and opened it. Sure enough, she saw that so many clothes he had prepared for her were still here. If a person really hated another person, he would hate even the slightest trace of the other person. After he was done with his work in the company, he would live here. Recently, he had also lived in the company for a long time, but none of her things had been thrown away. They were all intact and even neatly placed in the closet. Jean Wan was not in a hurry to take away her things. She took a step back, retreated to the bed, sat down, and looked up at the clothes in the wardrobe. The office outside the door was very quiet. She didn't know whether Mo Jingshan had eaten porridge or not, but Secretary Ku said that he had been busy all night. If he really refused to accept her kindness, she could only call Shenmu and ask him to contact a nearby hotel to send some food over. Now Jean Wan did whatever she wanted. After calling Shenmu, regardless of whether Mo Jingshan would eat or not, she just sat on the bed and stared at the clothes in the wardrobe. The air conditioner in the office had been adjusted to the most comfortable temperature by Jean Wan. Mo Jingshan looked at the bowl of porridge placed alone on the desk. After a long while, he put down the pen in his hand and rubbed between his eyebrows. Then Mo Jingshan received a call from the United States. CEO Mo. Su Jiland committed suicide in prison. Fortunately, we found her in time and barely saved her life when she was sent to the hospital, but the medical conditions in prison are too poor. She coughed up blood yesterday and kept asking to see you or call you. The man put down his hand that was rubbing between his brows. There was no joy or anger in his words. His calm voice carried a chilling indifference. What? Has the LAPD become so indecisive that they can't even control a person who's trying to make trouble inside? Do you still need me to show up? This. The man on the other side of the phone was covered in a cold sweat. CEO Mo, the Su family can't save her now, but Su Jilan said she used to be your fiancé. I think she's spoiled and can't stand the suffering inside. She has lost a lot of weight and keeps asking to see you every day. If it were someone else, we'd deal with it the same way, but after all, she used to be with you. Mo Jingshan's tone was indifferent. For such an unruly person inside, deal with her the way you do. But in her current state, if she dies here one day, we're afraid. Don't tell me anything about this Miss Su in the future. Whether she lives or dies, it's her own fault. It has nothing to do with anyone else. After hanging up the phone, Mo Jingshan turned his eyes to the door of the lounge. Jean Wan had been in there for a while, but she didn't come out. A moment later, the man got up, opened the door, and walked in. Stepping into the cool-tone lounge, he saw the woman who had just seriously said she would come in to take away her clothes, only to fall asleep on his bed. Seeing that she had been sitting at the end of the bed and then lay back to sleep, the man walked around the big bed, walked unhurriedly to the window, and drew the curtains with his left hand, covering all the lights and neon lights outside. Then he turned his eyes to the open wardrobe, where her clothes were hanging safely, occupying half of the space. He didn't feel it was an eyesore when he lived here every day, but now that the woman had checked them, Mo Jingshan finally felt something was wrong. He was about to take the clothes out of the wardrobe, but as soon as his hand touched one of them, he paused. With a bang, the man closed the wardrobe door. When he closed it, his hand was still empty, and he didn't take off any clothes. Jean Wan didn't expect that she would fall asleep in Mo Jingshan's office. She was going to pack up her clothes, but she fell asleep while sitting. After waking up, she closed her eyes for a long time before she had the courage to open them. She moved and found that she was still in the position of lying at the end of the bed. Her legs were hanging behind the end of the bed, and because of this position, they were a little numb. Hiss, she made a small sound. It was very light, but in the quiet lounge, it was particularly obvious. The man standing tall in front of the window turned around. You're awake. Jean Wan was startled. She didn't expect him to be here. She turned her head and saw the man standing not far away. He had one hand in the pocket of his trousers. He was still wearing the same flawless trousers and shirt from last night. He was standing there with his back to the morning sun shining through the window. He lowered his head and looked at her indifferently. Standing against the light, he seemed to be gilded with a layer of gold, but she couldn't see his expression. Looking at him like this, Jean Wan was in an indescribable trance for several seconds. However, when she was in a trance thinking that he was still her Mo Jingshan, the man gave her a faint smile, but his smile was too cold. Although you want to play the warm card in front of me, you have to remember clearly that I haven't lost my memory. I don't need you to remind me of all the beauty and warmth that happened in the past. It's a waste of time and emotion to touch me in this way. He might as well not speak and just stand here. She could still have a sweet dream. His words shattered her dream again. Jean Wan closed her eyes, opened them again, sat up, raised her hand to rub her hair, and said tiredly, I've been doing manual work in the new office building these days. I didn't expect that I could fall asleep sitting here. When she said this, she seemed to be mocking herself. Mo Jingshan, if you don't speak, you're really beautiful and pleasing to the eye, but now as soon as you speak, you directly poke at my heart. Really? She smiled. Don't you think so? Chapter 396. Jean Wan sighed. Although she had a good sleep, her legs were still a little numb. She hammered her legs and looked up at him. I'll pack my clothes in a minute. It's already dawn. Did you stay up all night? Is it because I took up your break room, or? I'll find time to rest when I'm tired. His words had cut off all her concern. Forget it. She wouldn't argue with him. Jean Wan got up, opened the wardrobe, and began to pack her clothes without a word. She took them off one by one and threw them on the bed behind her, saying, I'll ask someone to send me a suitcase later. You bought so many clothes for me. I can't take them away without a suitcase. The man didn't speak. It took Jean Wan more than 10 minutes to take out half of the women's clothes in the wardrobe. Then she fixed her eyes on the shirts inside, suddenly raised her hand, pulled off several shirts, and threw them hard on the bed. She turned to see Mo Jingshan's deep eyes staring at the shirts as though he was deep in thought. I've also worn these shirts of yours. More than once, I've swaggered around here in your shirts. Now that I'm packing up, I'll take these shirts away with me. Jean Wan turned her face away from him and stared at the shirts. The man was silent for a moment, turned his head to look out of the window, and said indifferently, Up to you. Jean Wan pursed her lips, suddenly turned around, pulled out 2 suits from the wardrobe, and threw them on the bed. When the man left the window and walked out coldly without looking at her, she said to his back, I've worn these coats before. The man grunted, opened the door of the break room, and walked out. Damn it. He didn't react at all. Jean Wan wanted to run out and say, I've slept with this man many times. Shall I take this man with me? But reason held her back, telling her that enough was enough. Right now, Mo Jingshan was much more stubborn than her. If she really did something too irrational, who knew what would happen to him? She called Xia Tian, and Xia Tian would pick her up with a suitcase. Jean Wan washed up in the break room, dried her hair, and changed her clothes. When she walked out of the break room, she saw Shenmu entering the office. When he saw Jean Wan, he habitually nodded to her in greeting. Jean Wan waved at him as though nothing had happened. On the contrary, Mo Jingshan remained expressionless. Jean Wan glanced at his desk. The porridge bowl was gone, and the food that she had asked Shenmu to send over last night was also gone. Someone must have taken it away. She didn't know if Mo Jingshan had eaten it or not, but the chances of him eating it were very slim. Xia Tian had promised Jin Wan to pick her up, but she didn't tell Jin Wan that she had set a new cooperation plan with BGY Group yesterday. On the day of the meeting, she had also arranged a dinner with their general manager, Mr. Vince. The next afternoon, when Jin Wan was about to get off work, Xia Tian suddenly mentioned such a dinner party. Jin Wan was baffled. Didn't you say that the cooperation plan is set for next month? Why is it so sudden? Anyway, this deal can't escape from our hands. That Mr. Vince also wants to curry favor with you, so he gave us the plan in advance. We'll just sign the contract a month in advance. Xia Tian winked at her. You have to go to this dinner party tonight. If you dare to screw me up, I'll resign in front of you. Jin Wan, in the past, when she and BGY often worked together, she had a lot of contact with that Mr. Vince. However, after learning about the flowers, she almost cut off contact with Mr. Vince. She thought that the other party was very sensible and understood her attitude, so he didn't pester her. However, this time, instead of sending flowers, she gave them the plan she had planned in advance. Although it wasn't the first time that Jin Wan had gone through the back door, the feeling of being forced to do something beyond her own abilities was really uncomfortable. This clearly made her owe Mr. Vince a favor. Jin Wan glared at Xia Tian. Xia Tian narrowed her eyes and smiled at her. Her expression was as though saying, since this great aunt wants to help you find a second spring, you have to go whether you want to or not. That night, Jin Wan was dragged to this dinner party by Xia Tian. Although it was called a dinner party, it was nothing more than eating, drinking, and talking about cooperation projects in a high-end hotel. After the dinner, they couldn't leave immediately, so they found a nearby entertainment club to drink and sing. Every time they met, it was the same. Dinner parties were nothing more than eating, playing cards, drinking, or doing something more in-depth. People in the business world knew these things too well and were familiar with many things. However, there were many upright people who simply took advantage of such an occasion to promote their relationship, business, and cooperation. The dinner party that Jin Wan participated in was already very high-end. If it were Mo Jingshan's dinner party, everyone would probably treat him like a Buddha, and no one would dare to ask him to condescend to participate in it in person. Just now, because of the spicy food, Jin Wan's stomach was not feeling well, so she didn't eat much. After arriving at the club, when everyone was having a good time, Jin Wan took a stack of matcha cakes and a glass of red wine to fill her stomach. As soon as she took a few bites, Mr. Vince came straight to her and sat down next to her. Jin Wan couldn't help but put down the glass and cake in her hand and said politely, "Sorry, I didn't eat much just now, so I'm a little hungry." "You should eat. What's there to be embarrassed about?" Mr. Vince smiled and sat next to her, looking at her plain appearance. Unlike other women who specially dressed up in a dinner party, she was so simple and casual that he wondered if he could smell the clean scent of shower gel and shampoo on her when he held her. Seeing Jin Wan didn't talk much as usual, he said, "I heard that you used to eat spicy food. What's wrong with you today? Is your stomach uncomfortable?" "Well, I'm a little uncomfortable." Jin Wan smiled politely at him and didn't explain too much. She moved aside another centimeter unobtrusively, trying to keep a distance from him. Chapter 397. Jin Wan smiled politely. "Thank you. 1 cup is enough for me." At this moment, Mr. Vince's secretary also sat down. The secretary was very young and most likely had a good impression of the handsome, rich, and young Mr. Vince. When she sat down, her gaze landed on Jin Wan's ring finger. Looking at her clean and slender fingers, she asked with a smile, "If I remember correctly, Miss G, you've been married for a long time, haven't you? Why haven't I seen you wearing a ring when we've seen you with our general manager?" Jin Wan lowered her head, forked another piece of matcha cake, and fed it into her mouth. After swallowing, she glanced at the secretary and said mildly, "You're thinner than when you got married, and your finger bones are too thin. I can't wear the ring, so I left it at home." "Why? Is it strange not to wear a ring after getting married?" "Of course it's not strange. It's just that I've never seen you wear a ring, nor have I seen you and Mr. Mo appear at the same time. Those who don't know might think that you're no longer together, or that Miss G deliberately let others think that you're single so that it's convenient for you to go out and socialize." The secretary looked at her face and only smiled. Back when Miss G and Mr. Mo got married, many girls in High City were heartbroken. I don't know why Miss G couldn't get over it. Instead of staying at home, she insisted on starting her own business. Her words were nothing more than reminding Mr. Vince beside her that Jean Wan was a married woman, and her husband was Imo Jingshan, whom he absolutely could not afford to offend. Mr. Vince couldn't possibly be unaware of this, and this secretary was clearly taking the opportunity to remind him. Jean Wan did not speak. She had no interest in the two people beside her, so these undercurrents between others were meaningless to her. "Last time, I heard from your assistant that Miss G, it seems that you've been very close to the bosses of various partners recently. You've been so busy dealing with them that you didn't even have time to accept our manager's invitations. It's really not easy to see Miss G today, but Miss G seems to be absent-minded. It seems that you're determined to win BGY's cooperation proposal and aren't taking it seriously at all." Jean Wan did not raise her eyes. She said mildly and indifferently, "Isn't the most appropriate display of seriousness after discussing the contract and the progress of the cooperation more important? Wasn't all the smiling faces before signing the contract just an earnest greeting? We're all old acquaintances, and it's not the first time we've cooperated. You should know the efficiency of our studio and the price of the purchase price. Why do you still need to do so much?" As for saying that Jean Wan didn't have time to accept Mr. Vince's invitation, it was true that Jean Wan told Xiao Ba to say so, but to say that Jean Wan was busy dealing with the bosses of other partners. Ha! Jean Wan smiled without saying anything. Jean Wan's expression remained cold and disdainful. The secretary was about to say something when Mr. Vince said coldly, "Are you drunk today? You've only had a few drinks and you're already talking nonsense." The secretary was stunned. She knew her boss's temper very well. She was unhappy and wanted to come over to mock Jean Wan, but when she heard this warning, she did not dare to say anything more. She took the opportunity to get up and walk away, but she still glanced at Jean Wan from time to time, as if she was afraid that Mr. Vince and Jean Wan would have any ambiguous relationship or further intimacy. She finally quieted down, but Jean Wan still looked indifferent. Mr. Vince handed her a stack of cake next to him. "Don't mind." Jean Wan smiled and took the cake. "It's nothing. People like you never lack admirers and suitors. Such a secretary is just one of them. It's not like I haven't seen this kind of secretary before." "Of course, I don't mind." Mr. Vince raised his eyebrows. "Then how many admirers and pursuers do you have around you?" Jean Wan's hand paused on the fork and turned to look at Mr. Vince. At the moment they looked at each other, Xia Tian suddenly raised her cell phone and took a photo of the two of them. Jean Wan paused and turned to look at Xia Tian with a jerk, but Xia Tian proudly held up her cell phone and shook it at her. Seeing her secretly pleased expression, Jean Wan knew that she was up to no good. Besides, Xia Tian had been very hostile to Mo Jingshan recently. She didn't know what Xia Tian would do if she took a photo that could easily be misunderstood. She quickly got up. "I'm going to talk to Xia Tian. I'll call someone else to come and drink with you later. I'll leave you." Jean Wan's face was cold when she got up. This was not the first time that Mr. Vince had met her. He knew that she was not as reckless as other female leaders of companies, but this was indeed the Jean one he knew. Mr. Vince didn't say much. He smiled and moved his legs to let her pass, without any intention of chatting or pestering her. He was a gentleman. If he hadn't been a gentleman, Jean Wan would have given up the cooperation with BGY Group and wouldn't have come to this kind of social event. Jean Wan quickly walked up to Xia Tian and reached out. "Give me your cell phone." "No." Xia Tian was also eating cake, protecting her cell phone as she ate. Jean Wan's face was cold. "Give it to me." Seeing that Jean Wan was about to be angry, Xia Tian simply reached out to pull her over, let Jean Wan sit next to her, and then picked up the cell phone to show her the photo. "Look, the angle at which you and Mr. Vince look at each other is perfect. But there is still a gap of 10 centimeters between your shoulders. Right? As you said in the magazine last time, you didn't hug or kiss each other. So what if you took a photo? Don't you think so?" Jean Wan didn't speak and reached out to grab it, but Xia Tian suddenly took back the cell phone and put it back in her pocket, not letting her touch it at all. There were so many people here, so Jean Wan couldn't grab it openly. She could only lean close to her and say in a voice that only she could hear, "You can take it, but don't send it out. Do you hear me?" Xia Tian snorted. "It depends on my mood. Anyway, don't send it." "Oh, then I'll send it to Imo Jingshan alone. If you want to die, send it to him." "You mean if I send this kind of photo to him, he'll kill me?" "No, you'll probably die in my hands first." Jean Wan's face was cold. Xia Tian, Chapter 398. Jean Wan really did not like the occasion that Xia Tian had deliberately arranged tonight. Although it was true that the main purpose was to discuss the cooperation with BGY, from the very beginning, she had deliberately given her and Mr. Vince some space to flirt. This goal alone made it impossible for Jean Wan to stay in this private room. Although she knew that Xia Tian would not be so impulsive as to randomly send out the photos, and that she only wanted to make her happy or divert her attention, Jean Wan did not have much of a good impression of Mr. Vince and his secretary. After chatting with everyone for a while, Jean Wan used the excuse of going out to get the drink list to get some fresh air. She picked up her bag and headed out. She had always been very clear about the matters between men and women. In her previous life, no matter how irrational she was, she would not mess around with a man she did not like. In this life, it was even more so. Jean Wan had just stepped out of the private room and was about to head to the front desk of the club to ask for another drink list when she suddenly heard a woman's low cry from the corridor of the private room. "Let go. I told you to let go." This voice was slightly familiar. Jean Wan paused in her steps and turned to look behind her. When she heard the voice earlier, she thought it was Nianj. Now that she looked back, she saw that it was indeed Nianj who was desperately trying to shake off the hands of the two men dressed in black. Nianj was usually a very gentle beauty. This was the first time Jean Wan had heard such a sharp voice from her. The corridor was very quiet. The people in the surrounding private rooms had already poked their heads out to look in this direction. However, everyone only glanced coldly at them before closing the door and ignoring them. Jean Wan saw that the two men had lowered their heads and were saying something to Nianj with cold expressions. However, Nianj was frantically trying to free her hands from their hands. Her eyes were filled with hatred and panic, and even traces of fear and helplessness could be seen. Jean Wan furrowed her brows. Although her relationship with Nianj was not particularly deep, they were at least acquaintances. However, even if it was only for Qin's sighting's sake, she felt that she had to help Nianj. More importantly, in her view, Nianj's face was red, and the redness was somewhat abnormal. "Let go." I didn't agree to your boss deal. Miss Sure, I advise you to be sensible. If you, such a young woman, want to take over Sheeta Group, you have to see if our boss agrees to let you take that position. Your father's company has been in the hands of our boss for a long time. Your father also intends to let you marry over. Since he has called you back from the United States, you know what he means. You can't hide from our boss after hiding for so many months. You might as well give in. The two of them didn't use too much force and didn't intend to hurt her. However, they didn't let her go and kept holding her back. Niange's gaze became more and more anxious, and her breathing became heavier. It turns out that from the beginning, he planned to step on our Sure family's heads. Back then, my father shouldn't have handed most of the power in his hands to him. What boss? Didn't he take advantage of our cooperation to devour everything of the Sure family step by step? Now, he's using something that belongs to me to challenge me. Who gave him the right to do so? Who gave him the courage? Do you think you can disregard the law just because your family is powerful? Miss Sure, you'd better be rational. Go in and have a good talk with our boss. I told you to go away. Sure, Niange said angrily, let go. Let go of me. If you don't let go, I'll really call the police. Miss Sure, go away. Miss Sure, you'd better come in with us quickly. If the boss is angry, you won't have a good ending either. Let go. Don't touch me. Jinwan walked over and said coldly, Gentlemen, I'm sorry. Just now, I didn't know what was going on here. I saw someone shouting to call the police, so I called the police. I don't know if it will cause you any trouble, but the police station is not far from here. The police are already on their way. She spoke as if she had accidentally called the police, but her tone was cold and full of warning. The two men finally let go of Sure Niange's hand, but they obviously looked at Jinwan unhappily, despising her for being a busybody. Jinwan walked over and stood in front of Sure Niange. Seeing the abnormal blush on her face, she felt that she seemed to have been drugged. She wanted to escape but was stopped by the two men. Miss Sure. At this time, one of the two men looked at Sure Niange with a cold expression and said very vaguely, I advise you to go with us. I'm afraid nothing good will happen to you in your current situation. After all, our boss is an old acquaintance of yours. If you meet a stranger like this. Sure Niange's hand trembled as she raised it and grabbed Jinwan's wrist. Jinwan felt the heat on her wrist. Sure enough, she guessed right. She must have been drugged. No need. I'll stay here with her and wait for the police to come. Sure Niange's voice trembled slightly, but her tone was extremely firm. Hearing that she was also threatening them with the police, the two men hesitated and finally gave her a warning look. Miss Sure, you'd better behave yourself. If you leave like this today, if our boss is unhappy, we can't guarantee the future of Sheeta Group. Feeling the stiffness in Sure Niange's hand, Jinwan subconsciously held Sure Niange's hand, lest she really made an irrational choice when she was not sober and irrational. The two men stared at them for a while. Seeing that Jinwan was going to stick her nose into other people's business, they turned and left unhappily. When the two men walked away and entered a private room, Jinwan took the opportunity to help Sure Niange into the bathroom not far away. Miss Sure, are you all right? Sure Niange forced a smile. I'm fine. Are you not feeling well? Or? Jinwan raised her hand to feel the temperature of her face. Did you drink something dirty? Sure Niange was a little embarrassed. She hesitated before answering, the thing I drank was indeed drugged. I don't know much about the medicinal properties of this thing. I'm really not feeling well now. I'm sorry, Miss G. Can you send me back to the hotel now? I'm afraid I can't go on my own now. All right, I'll send you. There were many hotels near this entertainment club. Since Shirnianj said so, she probably lived nearby. Chapter 399. Of course, she didn't mean to send Shirnianj to Chin's sighting like this, which was no different from sending a sheep into a tiger's mouth. But in her impression, the only person related to Shirnianj seemed to be Chin's sighting, not to mention the two of them were emotionally involved. I'm afraid you can't go back to your room like this. I'll call Dr. Chin, or I'll take you to the hospital. Shirnianj didn't seem to hear Jin Wan's words. Her body was hot, her cheeks were red, and her eyes were blurred. She staggered against Jin Wan's side. Seeing that she didn't hear her clearly, Jin Wan helped her steady and was about to walk out of the club when she saw a young man coming out of the private room the two men had entered. The man was a well-known figure in High City. Jin Wan seemed to have brushed past him at a banquet. She only had a very faint impression of him, but he seemed to have a very subtle relationship with Shida Group. The man glanced in this direction. To avoid getting into trouble, Jin Wan quickly took Shirnianj to hide behind the corner. When the man looked away again, she took Shirnianj and carefully slipped out of the club along the crowd in front of the door. Let's go. I'll take you to the hospital. Jin Wan also drank some wine tonight and couldn't drive. She helped Shirnianj to the roadside to stop a taxi. Shirnianj was probably really confused and irrational. Following by Jin Wan's side, she nodded in panic and then shook her head. After helping her into the taxi, he told her the address of High City Central Hospital. He then raised his hand to grab Shirnianj's hand that was about to pull open her clothes. He picked up his phone with the other hand and hesitated for a moment. He then glanced at the male driver in the taxi. The driver kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as though he had noticed that Shirnianj's condition was not right. Two women, one of whom had been drugged and looked seductive, faced the male driver who looked strong and strong. Jin Wan secretly sent a text message to Chin sighting with her cell phone, but she didn't know when he would see it. Dr. Chin, are you in the hospital? Shirnianj was drugged and is now with me. Should I take her to the hospital or do you want to come to a nearby hotel? Less than a minute after the message was sent, Chin Shitting called. What the hell are you texting? Chin Sighting's tone was cold. Obviously, it was because she was talking about Shirnianj, but even if it sounded cold, didn't he immediately call back? These duplicitous men were really in need of a lesson. Miss Shir is with me right now. Are you coming? Jin Wan only asked, but her eyes were wary of the male driver who kept glancing at them. Chin Sighting was silent for a moment. Jin Wan glanced at the driver's license plate and license plate number on the front of the taxi. I'm on Luyin Road right now. The taxi I took is High AR 589X. Are you going to rush over yourself, or should I bring someone over to look for you? The driver's eyes were originally fixed on Shirnianj, who was clearly drugged. When he suddenly heard Jin Wan tell him the license plate number of the taxi, he immediately calmed down, withdrew his gaze from the rearview mirror, and drove seriously, not daring to have any other thoughts. Chin Sighting clearly heard the caution in Jin Wan's words. Luyin Road was not far from the hospital. He said coldly, I just finished an operation. Send her to the hospital first. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Jin Wan helped Shirnianj out of the car. Although it was already dark, there were many people in front of the hospital. Shirnianj's breathing was heavy, and her face was too red. When they entered the hospital, they did not make much noise, but they still attracted attention. It was not until they entered the elevator that it became quieter. After entering the hospital, Shirnianj seemed to have figured out where she was. She was clearly uneasy, staring at the numbers on the elevator in a daze. I'm not sure if it's appropriate to send you to Dr. Chin. Right now, if you're still awake, you can refuse. I can send you to the hotel immediately, Jean Wan said softly. Shi Nianj leaned against her. Her hot breathing and increasingly heavy breathing made her look very uncomfortable. At this moment, she suddenly smiled and said hoarsely in a low voice, "It's not that I haven't slept with him, but looking at me now, I'm afraid the only way he can help me is to give me a tranquilizer. He won't do anything like what you think." Jean Wan did not speak anymore, holding her steadily with her hand. Although she did not ask more, she remembered that Nanheng had said that Shi Nianj had gone to America 4 or 5 years ago. Shi Nianj was 2 years older than Jean Wan. In the months after returning to China, the relationship between her and Qin Siding had clearly not eased. If they had really slept together, could it be that when she was 17 or 18, she and Qin Siding, Shi Nianj did not know if she was really confused by the drug. She leaned against Jean Wan's side, saying hoarsely and softly, "Back then, before I returned to America, I got him drunk and fell on him. After I raped him, I patted my butt and left. I've been gone for so many years." She smiled as she spoke, but there was loneliness in her eyes. "At that time, I was indeed young and impetuous, and I was indeed too selfish. When I chased him, I was so passionate, and when I left, I was so resolute and thorough. It's understandable that he hates me." Jean Wan, what could she say? She could only say that it was already very impressive that Shi Nianj had the courage to tear Dr. Qin's clothes. She could even rape a grown man. She could only give her a thumbs up. Impressive, impressive, really impressive. When they arrived at the floor where Qin Siding's consulting room was located, Jean Wan directly led them over. Qin Siding had just finished an operation and was probably in the ward telling the patient's family something. There was no one in the consulting room. Jean Wan lowered the temperature of the air conditioner so that the slightly cooler air could make Shi Nianj feel more comfortable. Just as Shi Nianj was helped to sit on the bed in the consulting room, the door opened. Qin Siding was wearing a white shirt and trousers. When he entered, he only put his white coat in the crook of his arm. As soon as he came in, he saw Shi Nianj sitting there. At a glance, he could tell that she was indeed not the same as usual. He paused and turned to look at Jean Wan. "Where did you meet her?" "My studio had a dinner party tonight. We were drinking in the entertainment club downstairs of the Greenwood Hotel. She was pestered by 2 men in the corridor. I saw that she seemed to be in a bad condition, so I took the opportunity to take her away." Jean Wan said and glanced at the time. "I'll leave her to you. I'll go first." Jean Wan was about to leave. Seeing that Qin Siding was probably not in the mood to chat with her, she said before walking out of the door, "By the way, the person who drugged her seems to be surnamed Xiao. That person has some status in High City, but I don't know much about him. I only know his surname." Chapter 400. My colleagues from the studio are still in the club. I'll take a taxi back. You don't have to worry about me. Jean Wan waved at him and happily opened the door to leave. Qin Siding glanced at the time. It was not safe for a woman like Jean Wan to go out and take a taxi by herself at such a late hour. He was about to call Mo Jingshan when Shi Nianj fell from the bed. His gaze faltered, and he rushed forward to carry her up. Jean Wan walked out of the hospital and was about to take a taxi when 2 black Mercedes stopped in front of her. The window of one of the cars rolled down, and the man with the surname Xiao sat in the car coldly, looking at her coldly, as if a venomous snake had suddenly jumped out of nowhere, staring at her coldly and fixedly. "You know Shi Nianj?" the man's surname Xiao asked. Jean Wan looked at him mildly. It seemed like when she came out of the club, these people had already followed the taxi all the way. They had personally seen her send Shi Nianj to Qin Siding's place. If she said that she didn't know him, she would only be lying to herself. No one would believe her. I don't know her, but I've seen her a few times. Jean Wan's tone was indifferent. Earlier, Miss Sher said she wasn't feeling well and asked me to send her to Central Hospital. I took a taxi to send her here. Is there anything wrong with that? The man's surname Shao lifted the corner of his lips. His voice was cold. You sent the woman I wanted to Chin Siding's place. Tell me, is there anything wrong with that? He was quite direct. He didn't hide anything in his words at all. Jean Wan was expressionless. I'm sorry. I've only met Miss Sher a few times. I don't know much about her. Even if I helped her out, I only sent her to the hospital. By sending her to this hospital, you've rescued this little rabbit from my cage. The man's surname Shao narrowed his eyes coldly. My rabbit is gone. Tell me, what should I do with you? The man's words sounded extremely gentle, but if one listened carefully, they were cold and frightening. His eyes seemed to be smiling, but they were sizing her up. Then what do you want? Jean Wan asked in return. There was no fear in her eyes. The other party watched her for a moment with a faint smile, slowly saying, the rabbit that I've carefully raised abroad for several years has disappeared. This cage is empty, and it looks lonely. Why don't I catch another rabbit? Even if it's not the original one, at least it doesn't look too bad. Of the two famous young ladies in Hai Ching, aside from Shi Nianj, it's you, Miss G, isn't it? The composure on Jean Wan's face cracked. You know me. The man laughed coldly, and the back door was opened by another man who looked like a bodyguard. Miss G, if you know what's good for you, get in the car. The man's surname Shao looked at her, his eyes seemed to be smiling but not smiling, seemingly cold but not cold. Jean Wan did not move. Her cool and quiet voice slowly came out of her mouth. Since you know me, you should know who's behind me. You dare to touch me, are you sure? The man's surname Shao looked at her expression that was neither afraid nor flustered and smiled coldly. His tone was indifferent as he said, the person you can't offend the most in Hai Ching is not the high officials or the mayor, but Mo Jingshan. You have the Mo family behind you. Of course I know that. But the people who are afraid of the Mo family don't include me, Shao Lui. The man clearly did not intend to speak any more nonsense. The car window slowly rolled up. However, the car door in front of Jean Wan remained open. The bodyguard said coldly, please get in. Jean Wan still did not move. If I don't do it, are you going to use force? The bodyguard said expressionlessly, then don't blame us for being impolite. Our CEO Shao has always been polite to women. Don't refuse a toast and drink a forfeit. Is drugging Miss Sher considered being polite to a woman? Jean Wan asked with a mocking smile. The bodyguard still said coldly, Miss Sher is just a special case. It was her father who drugged her, not our CEO Shao. If he wants a woman, he doesn't have to do that. This kind of thing had little to do with Jean Wan. She was just listening, but now it seemed that if she didn't get in the car, it would only lead to more unnecessary consequences. Even if she resisted with all her might, it would be useless. She looked around. There were no patrolling police cars, and it was already past 10:00 in the evening. There were fewer people in front of the hospital than before. If she rashly called the police or asked for help, her cell phone would probably be taken away. After thinking for a while, she didn't resist anymore and obediently got in the car. Shao Li sat in the passenger seat and silently watched Jean Wan get in the car through the rearview mirror. Jean Wan didn't resist at all after getting in the car. She just pressed the bag in her hand and asked calmly, is this kidnapping or what? Can you not confiscate my bag and cell phone? Shao Lui looked back at her. Have you ever seen me kidnap someone in such a moral way? Jean Wan also coldly looked at the bodyguard outside the car door and the driver in black in the car. If this isn't kidnapping, what is it? I've made it very clear. The rabbit in my cage has run away. I have to catch another one. I'm married. Why do you want to catch a married woman? That's not necessarily the case. You, rabbit, are more interesting. Moreover, you're very useful. At the very least, you can invite this god, Mo Jingshan, out. Was he going to use her as bait to lure Mo Jingshan out? Jean Wan instinctively sat up stiffly and was about to resist, but then she realized that she was alone in the face of 2 cars of men and bodyguards. She was afraid that she was overestimating herself. She looked at the man sitting in the passenger seat. No matter how sophisticated your kidnapping method is, it's still kidnapping. Xiao Lui coldly raised his eyebrows and didn't reply. Obviously, no matter what she thought, she couldn't escape now. Since the other party didn't intend to hurt her for the time being, Jean Wan didn't make too much noise in his car. Since she was already here, she might as well take things as they come. She leaned against the car door and looked out of the window. The car was air-conditioned and quiet, so she could silently feel the coldness, danger, and mystery emanating from this man surnamed Xiao. The author's words, 1. It's not that the female lead isn't decisive, but a person who has truly loved won't believe that love is gone just like that. She tried hard to fight for it, which means she didn't disappoint the one she once loved. Even if one day, as you say, she really doesn't come back, she won't feel guilty. 2. When the time is right, I'll torture back. I know the pace of the plot, so I don't have to worry that I'll go astray, or that I won't be able to make up for it. 3. Releasing chapters is very tiring, especially for a stay-at-home mom like me who has a baby to take care of. It's very difficult for me to save some chapters. I have to wait for the baby to go to bed before I can squeeze out time to write. My schedule is very irregular, and I write very slowly. I'm also very envious of those who can write more than 10,000 words a day. Chapter 401. Jean Wan was taken to a villa. It was a very luxurious and large villa. However, this villa was halfway up a mountain in the east of High City. It was surrounded by mountains. The environment and air seemed good, and no one restricted her freedom. However, her cell phone signal and internet connection were blocked. Moreover, there was no way she could leave this place unless she drove or took a car. Not to mention that there might be beasts on the mountain once she left the villa area. This rugged mountain road was built by them, and it was impossible for her to walk down it. Jean Wan was asked to stay here for one night. There was no one inside, only a servant in her 40s or 50s who could cook. The servant was mute. In the evening, Jean Wan found that the mute was not born mute, but her tongue had been cut off, and she looked horrible when she opened her mouth. Because of this, when Jean Wan spoke, the mute servant could hear her. After all, she was not born deaf and mute. She was served well here. After Xiao Lui personally sent her here, he only told her to stay here obediently. After being isolated here for 3 days, Jean Wan finally couldn't stay calm anymore. Anyone in such a place with no signal, no internet, and no freedom, except to eat, drink, and sleep well, would collapse, not to mention she was here with a strange servant whose tongue had been cut off. Every time the helper opened her mouth, Jean Wan would be afraid. What she was afraid of was not the helper, but what kind of people these people were. To be able to forcefully cut off a person's tongue, this kind of cruel method was clearly perverted. Now they were also perverted to keep her here. On the 4th day, Jean Wan couldn't sit still anymore. Several times she wanted to go out, but the servant would pull her, saying, and pointing to the wild forest outside the villa, meaning that it was very dangerous outside, and if she didn't leave by car, she would be in danger and couldn't go out. Jinwan could only sit in the front yard of the villa in vain, holding the cell phone that was fully charged but had no signal. She dialed 110 again and again, dialed Immerse's number, and dialed the numbers of all the people she might know, but the call didn't go through. On the morning of the 5th day, Xiaolui came with a rabbit that he seemed to have just caught at the foot of the mountain. Covered in blood, Rabbit was dragged into the villa by the ear by a bodyguard. Jinwan hadn't slept well these days. She sat in front of the villa with dark circles under her eyes. When she saw Xiaolui come in, she couldn't help asking, "How long are you going to keep me here?" Xiaolui glanced at her expressionlessly, took the rabbit from the bodyguard's hand and threw it in front of her. Jinwan subconsciously dodged backward. She lowered her head to look at the bloodied rabbit on the ground and instantly felt a chill run down her spine. She raised her head to look at him. "Are you a pervert? Have you ever seen a pervert give a roasted rabbit to his prisoner?" Jinwan glanced at the dead rabbit on the ground and took a step back. "I'm not interested in eating it." Xiaolui expressionlessly walked past her. When he entered the villa, he glanced at the breakfast placed on the dining table. Seeing that it hadn't been touched, he glanced back at Jinwan. "Miss G, are you not used to the food, or are you going on a hunger strike to resist?" Jinwan looked at him up and down, saying indifferently, "You're no one to me. Even if I starve to death here, it's useless. Why do I have to resist in such a stupid way? After being locked up here like an idiot for several days, anyone would lose their appetite. I can't eat anymore." Xiaolui glanced at her again, coldly smiling. "You're quite sensible." Jinwan glanced at him. "Seeing that I'm sensible, can you tell me why you locked me up here? Such good food and drinks may seem like nothing, but this kind of mental torture is even worse. What grudge do I have with you that you have to torture me like this?" Xiaolui coldly withdrew his gaze and didn't answer her. He sat at the dining table, asked the servant to bring new tableware, and ate the breakfast specially prepared for him by the servant. As he ate, he said calmly, "Miss G, sit here and let's have a chat." Jinwan walked over but didn't sit down. She just stood by the dining table and kept a safe distance from him. Xiaolui didn't force her to sit down. Glancing at her guarded expression, he said indifferently, "It seems that I overestimated your position in Immerse's heart. He is indeed more ruthless and calm than I knew him. He had learned the news that you were taken away by me 5 days ago, but he still hasn't taken any action." "Really?" Jinwan's expression was very calm. "Aren't you sad or sad? During the days I took you away, your husband didn't care about you at all. He didn't even take any action. There's nothing to be sad about. Our relationship has long been in trouble. It's normal for him to ignore me." Xiaolui looked at her for a while and smiled coldly. "Why do I feel that you want to cry?" Jinwan glanced at him coldly, and there was a lot of mockery in her eyes. "Do I look like I want to cry?" She obviously despised and repulsed Xiaolui, a pervert of unknown origin, and her tone was not polite. "I'm not surprised that a man who no longer loves me can be heartless to me now. I've already cried. Do I still need to cry in front of people like you?" Xiaolui casually smiled. "It seems that CEO really doesn't care about you. I thought he would do something in the dark, but he didn't do anything in the dark. It's clear that he doesn't even care about your life." Jinwan glanced at the man who deliberately poked her heart with words. "Oh." Xiaolui suddenly smiled. "Since Immerse doesn't want you, why don't you just marry me?" "Jinwan, CEO Xiao, do you have any misunderstanding about a married woman? Me and you. Let's not talk about why I should marry you. I still have the title of Mrs. Mo. What qualifications do you have to stand in front of me and ask me to marry you? Speaking of which, we've only met once, and today is the second time we've met. Xiao Lui leaned back in the chair, his voice still cold. I told you, you gave the rabbit I raised for many years to Qin sighting. Now you're the substitute rabbit. Since you're a substitute, there's no need for any feelings. Just stay in the cage obediently. Eat whatever I tell you to eat and do whatever I tell you to do. There's no reason. You really are a pervert. Jin Wan impatiently frowned. Since Mo Jingshan doesn't intend to save me, why do you still keep me locked up? Chapter 402. The 8th day. The summer heat persisted, but the wind in the mountain villa was very comfortable. Jin Wan calmed down and took it that she had taken some time off to spend her vacation in such a place. Xiao Lui did not come again these days but sent someone to buy some clothes she could wear. There were many types of clothes, both inside and outside. There were even swimsuits, and none of them were cheap. Perverts were indeed perverts. Even the way they kidnapped her was different from that of those fiends outside. Jin Wan took a nap and soaked herself in the pool when she got up. Anyway, there were only her and the mute helper here. Every day, she would talk to herself here. A few days ago, she was afraid that Xiao Lui would come, so she didn't dare to enter the pool. These days, she found that he probably wouldn't come again. Taking advantage of the hot weather today, she put on her swimsuit and entered the pool to kill time. Fortunately, the swimsuit was a conservative style. She stayed in the pool for a while, then climbed out, drank the lemon juice that the helper made for her, and returned to the water. It was really boring, so she practiced holding her breath in the water. She held a stopwatch and counted the time. Although she could swim, she couldn't hold her breath for too long. She still remembered that when she and Mo Jingshan fell into the sea because of a car brake failure, she choked in the water and coughed so hard that her lungs were about to explode. She repeated this practice for 2 hours and successfully and steadily increased the time she could hold her breath by more than 10 seconds. Jin Wan swam back and forth in the water contentedly. When it was almost evening, Jin Wan swam around again, held her breath in the water for a while, and abruptly came out of the water. To her surprise, she saw a figure standing by the pool, who seemed to have been watching her for a long time. Jin Wan's face turned cold. She immediately sank into the water from head to toe and looked warily at Xiao Lui, who had come out of nowhere. It seems that the person who was sent to buy clothes for you is not good. What kind of swimsuit did he buy? The parts that should be exposed are basically not exposed. Jin Wan raised her hand to wipe the water off her face and pushed her wet hair back. Even though she was wearing a conservative swimsuit, she was still submerged in the water. CEO Xiao, please be more self-conscious. I've only been kidnapped here by you. There's no reason for me to reveal anything that I shouldn't reveal in front of you. Go into the villa and hide yourself. Xiao Lui casually picked up the towel on the white recliner. I'll stand here. If you want to come out, you can come out. If you don't, just soak in it. Jin Wan, not only was he a pervert, but he was also a lunatic with terrible behavior. She had been in the pool for a long time. If she continued to soak like this, not only would her skin be damaged, but she couldn't continue to soak like this. She slowly swam over in the water. Just as Xiao Lui thought she was going to come up like this, Jin Wan abruptly raised her hand, grabbed the bottom corner of the towel, and yanked it down harshly. Xiao Lui paused, looked down, and saw that she had wrapped the towel that had fallen into the pool around her body. Disregarding the fact that the towel was also wet, she climbed up from the side of the pool with the towel wrapped tightly around her. Xiao Lui stared at her pair of long, white legs under the towel and walked over. Chapter 403. No matter how Jean Wan tried to defend herself, she was still held by the waist by the other party. He leaned close to her and stared at her coldly with an unfathomable meaning. Jean Wan frowned. Let go. There's water by the pool. It's very slippery. I'm afraid that Miss G will accidentally fall and leave some marks on your beautiful legs. That would be too much of a pity. Xiao Lui held her waist and did not let go. He seemed to have the intention of moving his face closer. Although his eyes were extremely hateful and invasive, they still had a trace of discomfort. Jean Wan's face was full of resistance and disgust. If you want to tease a woman, you have to know who you're dealing with. I'm afraid I'm not someone you can tease. Xiao Lui was indifferent to the warning and threat in her words. He deliberately sniffed the neck exposed by her bath towel. Smelling the faint cold fragrance on her body, he narrowed his eyes and said, although it's a substitute rabbit, it smells good. It's not much worse than Chernianche's. Instead, each has its own merits and charm. Jean Wan's waist was held by his hand. Although they were separated by the swimsuit and towel, she still felt as though she was entangled by an ice-cold viper. She felt a chill all over her body. The smell on this man's body was not unpleasant. It was a faint smell of tobacco. She was not in the mood to smell anything else. She raised her hand with an ugly expression to block between the two of them. Let go. Xiao Lui refused to let go of her waist. Since Mo Jingshan doesn't care about you at all, you might as well follow me. Miss G is the #1 socialite in High City. If you follow another man, I'm afraid no one can match you. Do you think you're worthy? Jean Wan asked coldly. Her two hands were still firmly blocking Xiao Lui's chest, refusing to yield even an inch. Whether I'm worthy or not, won't you know after you try? Xiao Lui raised his eyebrows slightly, and the smile on his lips deepened. He leaned close to Jean Wan's ear and said, Miss G, haven't you heard of the Xiao family? In terms of power and influence, the Xiao family and the Mo family have always been on par. The reason why the Xiao family isn't one of Hai Cheng's 4 largest families is because the Xiao family is close to Hai Cheng but doesn't belong to Hai Cheng. Whatever Mo Jingshan can give you, I can also give. Since he doesn't have any tender feelings for the fairer sex, you might as well follow me. Perhaps you can still fly out of this cage. Jean Wan sneered. Flying from one cage to another. I'm afraid only a psychopath with Stockholm Syndrome would like someone as perverted as CEO Xiao. Xiao Lui completely ignored her resistance, clasped her waist tightly, and abruptly pressed Jean Wan into his arms. He put his hand on her waist and bent down to smell the refreshing fragrance on her neck. Jean Wan struggled with all her might, pushing him away with both hands. While they were arguing, they didn't hear the sound of a car approaching from outside. Why is it so fragrant? Xiao Lui held Jean Wan and had already moved up to her neck. His hands were firmly pressed against her waist to prevent her from moving away. Jean Wan's hair all stood on end. She raised her foot and was about to give his lower body a hard kick to kick him away. All of a sudden, a familiar, clear voice rang from the entrance of the villa. CEO Xiao, you're putting your hands where they shouldn't be. Are you prepared to have both your hands chopped off? That voice was low, slow, and heavy, as if a thick killing intent was slowly seeping into it. Chapter 404. The moment she heard the voice, Jean Wan froze. She turned to see Mo Jingshan, who had appeared in front of the door. His cold eyes fell on Xiao Lui's hand, and for a moment, his black eyes narrowed dangerously, as if there was a strong killing intent hidden in them. Wasn't he indifferent? Didn't he take no action? Didn't he care about her life or death? Why did he come here? Although Jean Wan's heart was stirred, she just looked coldly at the man in that direction and didn't move. She loosened her hand that was pushing Xiao Lui away. Xiao Lui took the opportunity to hold Jean Wan tightly in his arms and glanced at Mo Jingshan with a faint smile. What? CEO Mo, you came here alone. Did you ignore my bodyguards or are you confident that you can take your wife away? Mo Jingshan's face was cold, his eyes deep, and his voice was cold. How dare you take my wife away? Jean Wan's eyes paused. From his tone, it seemed that he knew Xiao Lui. She turned her eyes sharply to Xiao Lui, who sneered and still held her in his arms. Mo Jingshan stood in front of the door, against the light, half of his face hidden in the evening light, and said indifferently, "Let her go." CEO Mo, you seem to be at ease leaving her with me. Why don't you leave her with me? Anyway, you don't have any tender feelings for her, and I happen to be short of a decent woman. I think Miss Ji is very good. With that, Xiao Lui leaned close to Jean Wan's neck and sniffed. Mo Jingshan slowly unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt. Without looking at Jean Wan's complicated eyes, he said coldly, "If you want to die, just say it. I'll fulfill your wish." For a moment, Jean Wan doubted that he didn't come to save her at all, because he appeared so casually as if he knew this place from the beginning but didn't show up for a whole week. Just as Xiao Lui said, he left her here. He left her here with peace of mind. There seemed to be something sinking in his heart bit by bit. Feeling the woman's sudden silence, Xiao Lui glanced down at her. It's really hurtful when a man is heartless. I'll give you one last chance. Why don't you come with me? Jean Wan narrowed her eyes and did not speak. Xiao Lui narrowed his eyes and sneered. When I asked her this a few days ago, she refused me with a look of disgust, but when I asked her again today, she became silent. It seems that she has wavered. CEO Mo, it's strange that a woman doesn't trust you one day. He had just finished speaking when Mo Jingshan's voice cut in. His voice was cold. Jean Wan, come here. These days, Jean Wan's mind was especially clear because of the quietness. She could tell that the relationship between Xiao Lui and Mo Jingshan was unusual, and even Mo Jingshan's attitude toward him was different from what she had imagined. She pondered for a moment and withdrew from Xiao Lui's arms. When Xiao Lui coldly raised his eyebrows and turned to look at her, she didn't go to Mo Jingshan but wrapped herself in the bath towel and turned to walk into the villa expressionlessly. After about 10 minutes, Jean Wan came out in clean clothes. The evening glow had faded, and the lights around the villa yard had been turned on. In the bright lights, she was running in the direction where she could finally escape, but her speed was very, very slow. Until she came to Mo Jingshan's side and stood by the man's side, she didn't say a word to him. Mo Jingshan didn't look at her but said to her, "Wait for me in the car." Jean Wan saw his car parked outside the villa just now. There was only one car. He did come alone. So simple. She had been taken here for a week, but he didn't move. Now that he finally came, he didn't move a single soldier. He didn't even need to say much. As long as he came, she could just follow him into the car and leave. What was the relationship between him and Xiao Lui? Jean Wan put away the thoughtful look on her face, didn't ask much, and got into the car. Xiao Lui's men didn't stop her, and the bodyguards outside just took a look at her and made way for her. Jean Wan felt even more strange. No matter how influential Mo Jingshan was, didn't this Xiao guy still have the guts to kidnap his woman? But in the blink of an eye, as soon as Mo Jingshan appeared, he solved the problem so easily. It seemed that everyone was just waiting for Mo Jingshan. These days, except for blocking all the news about her, they seemed to take good care of her. But what was this? Sitting in this long-lost black ghost, Jean Wan pursed her lips tightly. Mo Jingshan had been inside for a long time. She didn't know what he was talking about or what was going on inside. It wasn't until it was dark that Mo Jingshan finally came out. The moment the man got into the car, Jean Wan turned to look at him. "Are you familiar with CEO Xiao?" she asked. Mo Jingshan glanced at her. "Are you curious about my relationship with CEO Xiao, or about CEO Xiao himself?" Jean Wan gave a faint and cold smile. "Even if I'm really curious about CEO Xiao, I'm afraid you won't feel anything. After all, you left me here for a week and didn't care about me at all. My life, my safety, and how I live my life are no longer important to you." The man withdrew his gaze. "Don't bring trouble to yourself and give me less trouble. That's the right thing to do. Whether you hate or resent me, you've lived well and rested well here this week. You look much better. I'm afraid you won't bear to go back to such a resort if I come too early." Therefore, he had already investigated the reason why she was brought here, and he knew the cause and effect of it all. But he really left her here. The car was already driving down the mountain. Jean Wan suddenly said, "Stop, open the door, and let me out." She had maintained her rationality for too long, but at this moment, there was almost a sign of collapse. She clenched her hands tightly on her legs. What was the saying again? The straw that broke the camel's back. For 8 whole days. What he had been waiting for was nothing more than this final fatal strike. Mo Jingshan didn't stop the car. "If you want to lose your temper or make trouble, you can do whatever you want when you go back. This mountain is far from the edge of the city and is usually unguarded. Any fierce animal may lurk in the woods. Don't mess with me here." His meaning was clear. If she got out of the car now, she might be in unknown danger at any time. Jean Wan looked at the gradually darkening sky outside the car and didn't speak but raised her hand to open the door. Mo Jingshan turned the central lock of the car when she was about to open the door. Hearing the door being locked, Jean Wan's hand paused on the door. "Didn't I cause you trouble?" The man didn't speak. Chapter 405. After a few seconds of silence, the man abruptly stopped the car on the side of the road. His slender and powerful fingers suddenly fell on her chin, forcing her face to face with him. His eyes were deep and cold, and he repeated in a heavy tone, "I'll say it again. Don't throw a tantrum with me here." Jean Wan raised her hand and swatted his hand away with force. She gave a cold smile. "Do I look like I'm throwing a tantrum? Mo Jingshan, I've pulled out all the thorns on my body and faced you naked every day. Have I ever been throwing a tantrum?" He looked into her eyes and said indifferently, "There's no need to suppress your nature to this extent. Just be yourself. It's your ability to throw a tantrum. You've been wearing a mask on your face for too long, and now you can't take it off. Are you going to blame me for it?" Jean Wan looked into his eyes and gradually narrowed her eyes. "Do you want me to become the Jean Wan I used to be?" Mo Jingshan pursed his lips and sneered. "Don't you know what you used to be?" Jean Wan opened her mouth, paused, and suddenly said, "All right." She abruptly pushed his hand away from her chin but failed to do so. His fingers tightened imperceptibly. "You can't get out of the car here. I'm not kidding. Don't court death here, okay? Does my life or death still have anything to do with you?" "No, but at least I'm not morally allowed to watch you get out of the car to court death. You're really cold, heartless, and straightforward." He withdrew his hand, no longer holding her chin, turned back to drive, and said in a low voice that did not reveal his true emotions. "I've made it clear enough. You should have seen the truth. There's no point in deceiving yourself. Mo Jingshan, do you still remember what I used to be like? Jin Wan suddenly asked him, but when she asked this, her expression was too calm. The man did not answer. It seemed that she did not intend to hear his answer at all. It was already very late when she was sent back to the Yew Garden. Jin Wan came out of the bathroom, put on a nightgown, and wrapped her washed hair in a towel. She picked up the hairdryer, plugged it in, tore off the towel, and began to dry her half-wet hair. It was already 9:00 in the evening when Mo Jingshan sent her back to the Yew Garden. Because it was too late, he did not drive away. This was also the first time he returned to the Yew Garden since they returned. Although he did not return to the master bedroom, he was still in the previous study. Not long after, Jin Wan of the house, Jin Wan of the house of the family of the Yew Garden. In the past few days, it was really like being forced to take a vacation in the mid-mountain villa. She had to put down all her work, busyness, and social engagements. Her daily 3 meals were almost made according to her taste. Occasionally, there would be a new taste for her to eat. Seeing that she didn't eat it, the mute servant wouldn't force her to eat it. After that, she would cook according to her favorite taste. Unexpectedly, after a week of rest, she seemed to be in a much better state of mind. In this week, she had gained at least 3 kilograms, and her cheeks were rosy. If she hadn't been forced to the point of helplessness, Jin Wan would have suspected Xiao Lui's real purpose. But now she was still suspicious of his purpose. The man surnamed Xiao often looked at her as if there was something on her face worth looking at. But now that she had left the Yew Garden, she was not in the mood to think about whether this man was good or bad. After all, it had nothing to do with her. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Jin Wan got up to open the door. Auntie Chen was holding a cup of red dates and white fungus soup in her hand. Seeing that Jin Wan was still awake, Auntie Chen whispered, "Mr. Mo hasn't been back for a long time. I heard from the Mo family that he has been too busy these months and often works overtime in the company. I think he often stays up late. It's rare for him to come back, so I stewed some nourishing soup for him to eat as a midnight snack, but I saw the door of Mr. Mo's study was closed, so I didn't dare to knock on the door. Pour it out. He won't eat it." Auntie Chen paused. "But Mr. Mo, I'm tired. I'm going to rest. If there's nothing else, I'll close the door." Seeing that Jin Wan really didn't intend to say more, Auntie Chen hurriedly stuffed the bowl in her hand into Jin Wan's hand. "Madam, do as you see fit." Jin Wan closed the door and looked at the red dates and white fungus soup in her hand. She might as well eat it herself. In the end, Jin Wan knocked on the door of the study, but there was no response. Jin Wan continued to knock on the door patiently. She was not in a hurry, and she knocked on the door rhythmically for a few minutes. Finally, the door of the study was opened by the person inside. The man stood in front of the door, and his indifferent eyes fell on her nightdress. His eyes were clear. "What's the matter?" Jin Wan handed the bowl in her hand to him and said carelessly, "Auntie Chen made red dates and white fungus soup. She asked me to bring it to you." Not only did she say it carelessly, but she also didn't pay attention to the soup in the bowl. Because she had almost drunk half of the bowl. Looking at the red dates and half a bowl of white fungus soup, the man was expressionless. "If you like it, drink it yourself. You don't need to bring the other half to me. You sound as if you will drink it even if I bring the whole bowl here." Mo Jingshan didn't answer her, nor did he block the door. This was the Yew Garden, and Auntie Chen and the other servants were mostly Grandfather Mo's spies. He didn't refuse her so coldly and left the door open. He didn't stop her from leaving or coming in. Seeing the man turn around and go in, Jinwan saw that he was not working but reading some translation materials. The computer on the desk was turned on, but only on the desktop wallpaper page, which meant that he just turned it on but didn't use it. Other company documents automatically printed by the printer in the study were still placed beside the computer and hadn't been signed, which meant that he was not in a hurry to sign them and that he was not busy tonight. Jinwan walked over. When the man put away the translation materials, she walked up to him and watched him put the translation materials into the bookshelf. Mo Jingshan didn't say a word, but after Jinwan looked at him with scorching eyes for a long time, he picked up the company documents beside the computer and turned to look at her before opening them. Are you going to watch me work here? Can't I? Jinwan tilted her head and seemed to be smiling, but there seemed to be a sharp edge in her clear eyes. Chapter 406. Jinwan stood by and watched him work. After a while, he called Shenmu to explain some matters related to the company's documents. She watched him put down the phone and sign the documents. She watched him frown and be expressionless from time to time. Jinwan finished the half bowl of red dates and white fungus soup. She stood by and watched him while drinking the food in the bowl. After eating, she put down the bowl, wiped the water stains on the corner of her mouth with her fingers, glanced at the man's unmoved profile, raised her hand, and pressed the company document in front of him. The man paused and looked at her again. What do you want now? Jinwan stared at him. Since you think my feelings and all my forbearance are because of the mask on my face, why don't I let you recall what I used to be like tonight? With that, she leaned over and leaned close to the man's expressionless face. She looked at him with her eyes. I suddenly missed the days when I could do whatever I wanted. I didn't care about anyone's feelings. I could do whatever I wanted, get whatever I wanted, and abandon whatever I wanted. Then she suddenly fell back and sat on his lap. She put her arms around his neck and smiled at him. I have to fight for what I want. You are the one I want. Why don't you teach me how to take you back? Mo Jingshan looked at her and said, You are the one I want. Why don't you teach me how to take you back? Mo Jingshan slowly furrowed his brows. Childish. With that, he was about to push her away from his lap. However, Jinwan sat firmly on his lap, raised one hand to hold his neck, and slowly moved one hand up his shoulder. Her two fingers, as if imitating a person walking, slowly moved over the spot on his back where he had been seriously injured in the car accident to save her. She had just taken a shower before coming here. Other than the faint cold fragrance and the fragrance of the shower gel on her body, there was nothing under the thin summer silk nightgown. She sat on his strong legs with the thin nightgown separating them. Jinwan smiled at him. She lifted his chin with one hand and moved closer. Just a finger's distance away from his lips, their breaths entwined, but they were neither close nor distant. Jinwan, do you know what you're doing? The man didn't avoid her. He maintained his original posture and looked at her coldly. Jinwan did not reply. She appeared to be passionate and smiling, but her eyes were cold. I'm sitting on my husband's lap. Is there a problem? The man's eyes were as dark as ink. When she smiled at him again and again, he said coldly, Know your limits. Don't be too willful. The smile on Jinwan's face grew wider. Willful and reckless. Mo Jingshan stealthily avoided her eyes. Get up. Don't sit here. Jinwan chuckled and leaned into his embrace. She lay on his shoulder and wrapped her arms around his neck. All right, give me a kiss, and I'll get up. Mo Jingshan's gaze was indifferent. He seemed to have seen through her desperation and suddenly pushed her off his lap without mercy. He was very fast, so fast that she was pushed away before she could feel his increasingly obvious reaction. Jean-Wan staggered and stepped back. She did not insist. She leaned against the table and watched him for a while. During this time, she did not say or do anything. She only watched him. Then something seemed to fall on the table behind her, and she walked toward the door of the study. When the door opened and closed, Jean-Wan had already left without looking back. Mo Jingshan turned to look at the expensive fountain pen she had thrown back onto the table. The sturdy body of the pen had actually been bent by her. On the weekend, Mo and Wan's studio finally moved into a new office building. The whole building had more than 20 floors, all of which belonged to the studio. The number of employees had also multiplied. However, because Jean-Wan had not applied for a change of the name of the studio, it had not been named after the company but was still called the studio. During the 3 consecutive days of celebration, various partners sent gifts, and some leaders of partners came to congratulate them. Even several companies that had invested in the studio also expressed their congratulations. Only the Mo Corporation, which had invested $200 million in the Mo Corporation, did not make any move. After the 3 days of celebration, the Mo Corporation suddenly received a sum of money from Mo and Wan Studio. $200 million and the profits and dividends required in the investment contract were transferred into the financial channel of the Mo Corporation overnight. The finance department of the Mo Corporation was in an uproar. They didn't expect that the real estate studio under Jean-Wan's name could really make so much money, and it seemed that the real estate industry would continue to rise in the near future. The prices of all the land and buildings under construction that Jean-Wan had purchased in large quantities were soaring. It was definitely a new beginning for the domestic real estate industry to make so much money in such a short period of time. However, when she could continue to take the opportunity to invest in large quantities to buy land, her studio suddenly returned the original investment of the Mo Corporation. During this period, Jean-Wan did not contact Mo Jingshan again. After receiving the money, Shenmue was surprised when he received the news. He showed the records of the money to Mo Jingshan. CEO Mo, Mrs. Mo returned the money just like that. She even calculated the interest and everything else according to the original contract. There's no difference at all. This, Mo Jingshan stared at the record of the money for a long time. As soon as they learned that Jean-Wan's studio would have a large lack of funds, many investors who had gradually seen the business opportunities in her industry would be eager to fill the gap immediately. Indeed, there was no need to worry that she would be short of funds now. Many investors would only move as soon as they heard the news and try their best to sign a cooperation agreement with her studio. Although Jean-Wan valued relationships, once she made a certain decision, she was very straightforward. Her straightforwardness made people wonder if she had made such a plan long ago, but there had been a string hanging on her, and this string had finally broken. The clothes in his office had been removed, and all the clothes she had touched had been removed. Just this morning, he received the room card and key to AO Lawn International sent by Jean-Wan. As a result, not only did she return the key, but she also returned the money invested by the Mo Corporation. Chapter 407. After the celebration party, the staff of the studio gathered for dinner near the new office building. Xiao Ba and the others didn't dare to ask more questions after the studio returned the $200 million to Mo Corporation's account overnight. Although the studio had a lot of liquid funds under its name, the cooperation with other investors was still going on, but Jean-Wan returned the debt to Mo Corporation as soon as possible. Well, even if they didn't know what happened, they could tell that something must have happened between Jean-Wan and CEO Mo. And it must be a big problem. Xiao Ba and other colleagues frequently looked at Jean-Wan. The quieter she looked, the more worried they were. Boss, if you are in a bad mood recently, the studio has moved here anyway. There are so many employees and Sister Xia. You can take a break for a while, Xiao Boss said. I'm very happy that the studio has developed independently to this point. How can I be in a bad mood? Jin Wan held a bottle of beer but didn't drink it. She just shook it in her hand and put it on the coffee table. Xiao Ba wanted to ask more questions, but Xia Tian kept winking at her. Xiao Ba didn't dare to ask more questions, so she took the wine in Jin Wan's hand and gave her a glass of juice. Now our studio is becoming more and more successful. Sister Xia is the vice president, and there are many people in charge of each department. Boss, you need to relax. Why don't we book a ticket for you to travel to City H these days? You can go out for a vacation, okay? Didn't I come back from vacation a while ago? Jin Wan raised her eyebrows. What vacation did you have? Why don't we know? It was the week when I suddenly disappeared. Jin Wan held her chin with her hand, gently touched her cheek with her finger, and said with a faint smile, I secretly went on vacation that week. Jin Wan's expression clearly didn't mean that she had gone on vacation. Xiao Ba and Xia Tian looked at each other. Xia Tian didn't speak, but turned to look at Jin Wan, who didn't say much, and then at her hand. You've been back from the United States for so long, but I haven't asked you about the scar on your hand. Xia Tian pointed at the burn on the back of Jin Wan's hand and wrist that hadn't completely faded. Last time, I accidentally mentioned it, but you didn't say anything. Since then, you've been applying concealer on your hand every day, so I forgot to ask. As she spoke, she pulled Jin Wan's hand over and looked at it over and over again. This scar has been there for a long time. Your skin used to be white and tender, but now it's obviously scalded. When and where did it happen? Why is there such a big scar? It's nothing, I just accidentally scalded myself. Boss, don't apply concealer on your hand in the future. It's better to stick to skin care and scar removal ointment. Fortunately, there's only a little redness. It's not obvious if you don't look carefully. I think it'll disappear after a while. Concealer will affect the healing of scars. Don't use it anymore. Xiao Ba's voice was soft, and she reached out to touch Jin Wan's hand. It must have hurt a lot. Jin Wan looked at her hands and remembered her miserable life. Now that she had finally left that terrible place and returned to High City, it was nothing more than jumping from a strange fire pit into a fire pit she was familiar with. She had been looking forward to returning to High City as soon as possible. But now she was finally back. Jin Wan changed the topic and finally led it to Xia Tian's recent relationship problems. The atmosphere at dinner became lively again because of Xia Tian's awkward relationship experience. Everyone was laughing and joking when Jin Wan's cell phone rang. She picked up the cell phone and looked at the caller ID, picked it up, and said indifferently, "Hello." When she heard what the person on the other side of the phone said, she said calmly, "I see. Jialan Bar in downtown High City." Elegant blues music sounded, and the slow singer in the bar was holding a guitar and singing. Young men and women hugged and caressed on the dance floor, ambiguous and charming. Jin Wan walked across the dance floor expressionlessly, wearing the soft white dress she had worn when she left the dinner party. This bar was similar to a combination of a noisy bar and a bar. There were many people and it was very hot. She took off the matching silk scarf around her neckline and threw it into her bag. Without the cover of the silk scarf, the V-shaped neckline exposed a large area of skin around her snow-white collarbone. Although it was not too naked, it still attracted the attention of many men on the dark dance floor. But her eyes didn't seem to come to such a place to drink and spend the long night. Her cold and indifferent expression attracted people's attention, and she soon walked inside to the place Qin Sighting said on the phone. Qin Siding said that Mo Jingshan was drunk and called Jin Wan to pick him up. Qin Siding originally wanted to drive away the girl who had been wandering around their bag. After wandering around for a long time, no one paid attention to her. However, the moment Jin Wan appeared, Mo Jingshan, who had been quietly drinking, suddenly pulled the girl who happened to come to his side to sit on the sofa. Although he did not put his arm around the girl's waist, he took the expensive bottle of wine from her hand, opened it personally, and chatted lightly with the girl who took the initiative to come up to him. Mo Jingshan was clearly not drunk, but if he was not drunk, why would he, who was expressionless and didn't even bother to look at the woman who took the initiative to court him, now take the initiative to sit down with this woman? Normally, he would never provoke a woman. Even Shu Yan had invited him several times, but he had only gone with her once because there was a problem with the counter of one of Shine's brands in the mall. Even then, he had only gone to deal with the problem and dispute at the counter. A man who had no interest in any woman except Jin Wan was actually holding a strange bar girl who smelled of cheap, pungent perfume by his side. Was she really going to get a divorce? Qin Siding was about to ask the bartender who was about to lean on Mo Jingshan to go away, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jin Wan coming over from the dance floor with an expressionless face. He raised his hand and was about to drive her away. He was surprised that Jin Wan came so fast. Chapter 408. He's not drunk. Why does he need antidote? Jin Wan didn't even look at Qin Siding. She looked past the tall and long-legged Qin Siding and at the man in the sofa. She glanced at the scantily dressed woman next to him. With just a glance, the woman instinctively sensed the relationship between Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan and immediately gave her a provocative look back. Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan looked at her. Qin Siding thought Jin Wan would fly into a rage, but she didn't lose her composure. Mo Jingshan didn't seem to be completely sober. Qin Siding did order a lot of wine here today, but the man's half-drunk appearance made him look colder and lazier. The buttons of his black shirt were undone, and the waitress sitting beside him kept looking at his collar with a fascinated look. Qin Siding could save people's lives, but he couldn't save the feelings between people. He glanced at Jin Wan, who suddenly raised her hand and said abruptly, "Jin Wan, if you have anything to say it when we leave here. There are too many people here. Bear with it. Don't be impulsive." She still looked at Mo Jingshan and then at the scantily clad woman who kept squeezing against him. Mo Jingshan, the way you humiliate yourself is really eye-opening. I've always learned from others. Do you like to humiliate yourself in this way? Mo Jingshan looked at Mo Jingshan and then at the scantily clad woman who kept squeezing against him. Mo Jingshan, the way you humiliate yourself is really eye-opening. Hearing Jin Wan's words, Qin Siding raised his eyebrows. In an instant, he saw Jin Wan take a step back and unbutton the middle button of her dress in front of Mo Jingshan and him. Her dress had a V neckline, and there was a round button at the bottom of the neckline. She only needed to unbutton one button to instantly turn the intellectual and beautiful white dress into a sexy deep V-long dress. The change of one button would faintly reveal the ravine in front of her chest to many people. Qin Siding turned his eyes away, and Mo Jingshan clenched the glass cup in his hand imperceptibly. His cold eyes looked at Jin Wan's movement and instantly darkened. Jin Wan did not say much. She only looked at him coldly and indifferently, dragging out her words as she slowly said, "Do you know what it means to be Hai Chang's #1 socialite?" Seeing that the man's eyes were as dark as ink, Jin Wan's face revealed a seductive smile. In Jin Wan's eyes, the title #1 socialite was never a compliment. Instead, it was more of a derogatory one. Most of them came from the young masters who had heard of her reputation and met her, but most of them came from the men she had rejected or ignored. The so-called number one socialite was a beautiful woman who had the ability to seduce men. However, because no one truly understood her and no one had truly interacted with her for too long, everyone thought that she was probably proud and dissolute deep down. She looked very aloof, but in reality, she was not born with any stable elements. The words, number one socialite, contained equal proportions of praise and ridicule. It didn't sound good to Jean Wan anyway. This was the impression Jean Wan left on everyone. She had sealed that version of herself on the night of her rebirth, but at this moment, she had released it again. Jean Wan untied her hair, and the seaweed-like hair that had been tied high behind her spread out like waves behind her back. Jean Wan was already eye-catching when she first appeared, and now her movements attracted the attention of countless men. She bent down slightly, and the deep V-neck outlined the outline of her chest in a way that was enough to make people's noses bleed. She picked up a bottle of brandy on the table, poured it into a glass on the side, and then picked up the glass to play with it in her hand. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. Then she blinked and looked at the men behind her in confusion and charm. "Is there some ice in my glass? I'll go get it for you." "Waiter! Hurry up and bring the ice over." "Who is this? I can't believe I see such a beautiful girl in such a place." Jean Wan looked at the group of men with a seductive smile, and then gently shook the glass in her hand. Several men grabbed a few ice cubes from the ice bucket in the hands of the waiter who had just rushed over and rushed to pour the ice into her glass. One of the men rushed over the fastest and successfully gave her the ice cubes. Jean Wan smiled at him, holding the square glass in one hand and hooking the man's chin with the other. Her red lips opened slightly, and she said lazily, "Thank you." The man's bones seemed to have softened in an instant. Jean Wan bit her red lips again, shook the glass in her hand with a smile, and said slowly, "I can't hold my liquor very well. I don't know how strong this brandy is. After drinking this glass, there shouldn't be any problem, right?" No, you can drink as much as you want. This bottle is only 40 degrees. Wrong, the bottle on the coffee table looks unremarkable, but it's a brandy with more than 50 degrees. Let's not talk about whether it's expensive or not, but this brandy is very strong. Beauty, if you can't hold your liquor well, don't drink it. It's all right, Mississippi. You can drink as much as you want. How about I treat you? More and more men crowded around. Jean Wan's face was half seductive and half innocent as she looked at the square glass in her hand. A brandy with such a high degree is indeed rare. It said that it's not cheap. If I don't try it, it'll be a waste of God's gift. Besides, it's not easy for the girls who go around selling alcohol. Since I've already bought this wine, it'll be disrespectful if I don't drink it. As she spoke, she brought the glass to her lips and took another gentle sip. The wine stain left a bright glow on her lips. As the man had brought in more ice cubes for her, she gently bit one of the ice cubes on the edge of the glass and gently licked it with the tip of her tongue. At that moment, the sound of inhalation rose and fell. She turned to look at Mo Jingshan, who was sitting on the sofa, and met his heavy, stern gaze. The moment she met his gaze that seemed to be hidden under a thick fog, Jean Wan released the man's chin that had been lingering on her fingertips. She turned to support herself with one hand on the coffee table and leaned down to look at the man who was sitting motionlessly on the sofa. Because of this angle, the curve of Jean Wan's chest was even more tempting. Although she did not reveal anything that shouldn't be revealed, it was just right to seduce him. Mo Jingshan's gaze was cold as he watched her. His hand was still holding the square glass. He did not move, but the glass seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Chapter 409. The bar girl sitting next to Mo Jingxian was a little unconvinced, but when she saw Jin Wan was bewitching like a demon in these few minutes, she clicked her tongue and didn't dare to challenge her. After all, even if she took off her clothes and stood here, she couldn't achieve the effect that even a woman would be attracted to her. Just now, she came here wearing this and an ordinary dress, but she didn't expect that she could achieve this effect by unbuttoning her hair and changing her smiling face. So beautiful. So beautiful that even women wanted to commit a crime. In fact, the bar girl just wanted to make some money. Although she wanted to cling to the man next to her, she vaguely felt that she couldn't afford to offend this man and that woman. Although the man didn't ask her to go away, he didn't put his arm around her waist or take the initiative to touch her. At this moment, his attention was completely focused on that beauty. The bar girl slowly backed away from him, lowered her head, and quietly ran away. Jin Wan noticed this scene, but the smile on her face didn't change. Her purpose was not to drive that woman away but to Mo Jingxian. Jin Wan attracted a group of men who rubbed their hands and looked at the man sitting quietly on the sofa with a faint smile. Mo Jingxian, it's just a divorce, isn't it? Jin Wan opened her mouth. Her voice was filled with the smell of brandy and the chill of ice. She spoke slowly, but everyone around her could hear her clearly. If I agree to sign the divorce papers tomorrow, does it mean that it has nothing to do with you if I'm taken away by anyone here tonight? Jin Wan said and took another sip of wine. She didn't drink as freely and passionately as those women who often drank, but this kind of behavior aroused the interest of many men. Jin Wan's long hair flowed down her back like a waterfall, and the skin of her collarbone and chest was as white as jade in the light, tempting people to come forward and touch her. She was so beautiful. When those men heard that she was about to be divorced, they immediately stared at her like wolves and tigers. It was as if she became a woman who had been abandoned outside of marriage in the next moment, someone would pounce on her and take her away in the next moment. Such a night was too enchanting, and such a woman was too seductive. The surrounding blues music did not stop, so no one heard clearly the name Jin Wan had called the man on the sofa. No one heard the 3 words Mo Jingxian. The man on the sofa sat in the middle of the booth. This was a relatively quiet booth in the bar. The lights were dim, and the man's expression was hidden in the darkness. The people around him could not see it clearly either. Divorce? She's so beautiful and there's actually a man who's willing to give up on her. Leave. Leave quickly. If we divorce today, we'll take you to get our marriage certificate tomorrow. Whistles and teasing sounds came one after another. The atmosphere around Mo Jingxian gradually became more and more hazy, and the coldness in his eyes gradually became colder. Jin Wan straightened up in front of the booth with a smile and no longer looked at him. She raised her head, drank up the whole glass of wine, and casually threw the glass to the ground. The sound of the glass shattering was like a switch, causing the man's seemingly calm brows to slowly furrow. Jin Wan turned around and raised her hand to wave her soft long hair behind her back. The sensation caused by this small corner of the bar was probably noticed by the lighting technician. As she walked onto the dance floor alone, the lights on the dance floor went out one by one because of her movements, leaving only the darkest one. As she spun on the dance floor with her hair and long skirt flying, the lights became brighter bit by bit at a very slow speed, and as she spun faster and faster, the brightness of the lights also increased at the same speed. She was already a dazzling existence. All of a sudden, she no longer hid and ignored her beauty and suddenly shone in the crowd. Under the lights, she was like an elf breaking out of the ground. Every time she spun, the hem of her long skirt would fly up, and her slender, white legs would be exposed. Countless men were attracted one by one, and whistles came one after another. Jin Wan simply spun her skirt. Her dress was not very revealing, but her eyes were extremely charming. She performed such a lingering and moving visual effect, and the atmosphere in the whole bar was ignited. Someone entered the dance floor and handed her a glass of wine. Jean Wan took it with a smile. When all the lights gathered on her, she raised the wine in the glass and splashed it up. She raised her head, looked at the dripping wine, and then closed her eyes, letting it fall on the top of her head. The wine rolled down along her hair bit by bit. It was not enough to wet her hair. Wherever the wine fell on her white skirt, that part would become translucent. This glass of wine was too little in the eyes of those men. In an instant, countless people handed her the wine. Jean Wan smiled and spun to a man's side. As she took the wine glass, she deliberately pulled the man's arm and spun around. When the man couldn't help but put his arm around her waist, she spun out of his arms. Although she didn't let the other party touch her, all the men around felt their hearts itch when they saw this. Jean Wan didn't say anything. Jean Wan's dance was casual and hot. It was too hot here. Sweat had slid down her neck and slowly rolled into her deep V-neck, making people's imagination run wild. Her white skin looked more charming in the light. Her long black hair, which reached to her waist, swayed back and forth. Sweat soaked her black hair, but it didn't affect her beauty at all. Instead, more men in the bar rushed in this direction and surrounded her in the center of the dance floor. Jean Wan splashed the wine up again. When the wine splashed over her, the material of her back was soaked, and the dress, which had become translucent because of the wet, outlined the outline of her back. All the men and women's eyes were on her, but Jean Wan's eyes were looking in the same direction from beginning to end. Even though the crowd was very dense, she could still see that man through a small gap in the crowd. More and more people came around, the dance floor became hotter and hotter, and she sweated more and more. She didn't take any more wine. Her sweat had soaked her dress, and the material of her chest was soaked bit by bit. Her clear skin seemed to be covered with a layer of light because of the sweat, which made her more attractive. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.